What if giants once ruled the earth? It's a question that drifts like a feather across the midnight sky, simple yet heavy, one that feels both distant and strangely close. As you lie back, perhaps in the quiet of your room, picture the stars above. Each one is a silent witness, glowing softly, as though they carry stories far older than our memories. And among those stories is one that whispers of a time when the world was not ruled by kings or emperors, but by beings whose size and strength made them seem almost untouchable. The thought alone slows the mind, drawing us into an ancient wonder. These giants, the Nephilim, were not simply characters of imagination. Their shadows stretch across sacred texts, ancient scrolls, and myths whispered by civilizations long gone. Imagine walking across a valley where the very footprints in the ground seemed too large for any normal man. Imagine hearing tales from elders about creatures born of mystery, beings who carried both power and destruction in their blood. Yet, why does this matter to us today? Why think of ancient giants when our world is already filled with its own struggles, pride, greed, and the endless chase for power? Maybe because the story of the giants is not only about them, it is about us. Every time we see someone consumed by greed, every time pride leads a heart to ruin, every time power is worshipped above compassion, we see the very same spirit that once walked the earth in towering form. The Nephilim may be long gone, but the lessons they left behind remain written in the hidden corners of history. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a land before time looked the way we know it now. The sky darker, the stars brighter, the earth quieter. Villages huddled close together, fires burning against the cold night air, people whispering prayers to the heavens for protection. In those nights, when the wind carried strange sounds from the hills, parents would hold their children closer, reminding them of the giants who roamed far away, reminding them of the danger of forgetting the one who made the heavens and the earth. The giants were not just tall, they were mighty in ways that frightened even the strongest warriors. Their presence shook the courage of men. Their choices, born from pride and corruption, brought sorrow to the world. And if we look carefully, their story is a mirror of our own. How many times have we seen the desire for control break families? How often has the hunger for more wealth, more recognition, more dominance, pushed hearts into darkness? The ancient story of the Nephilim is a quiet warning, echoing through the ages. Whenever pride rises too high, a fall is never far behind. Yet tonight, under the calm of this storytelling, we are not here to fear. We are here to listen, to rest in the gentle flow of a tale that has been told for thousands of years. The fire of this story still glows faintly, and as it burns, we draw closer, warmed not by fear, but by curiosity. Legends say the Nephilim were born from forbidden unions, where heaven's mystery and earth's longing collided. Out of that collision came children who were never meant to exist, giants who carried both brilliance and destruction. Some saw them as rulers, others as monsters, but all remembered them as beings who changed the balance of the world. Their hunger for power grew like flames rising higher, and soon their shadows spread across valleys and mountains alike. But pause here just for a breath. Imagine the sky above as you hear this, dark, endless, sprinkled with stars. The same stars that once looked down on a world filled with these giants, now looking down at you. What a humbling thought, that the heavens have seen it all. Our small struggles, our victories, our moments of weakness, and our moments of grace. When we hear the story of the Nephilim, we are reminded that history is not only about kingdoms and battles, it is about the heart. It is about what happens when pride grows unchecked, when greed is fed, when the desire for power swallows compassion. It is about what happens when the balance between heaven and earth is ignored. And so, as this story begins, we ask again, what if giants once ruled the earth? Would we see them only as towering beings of flesh and strength, or would we also see the reflection of our own struggles? The night is still, the stars are kind, and the story is just beginning. Let your heart rest, let your thoughts slow, and let this ancient tale unfold gently, like a song carried by the breeze. Before we drift deeper, I want to pause for just a moment and speak softly to you. This channel is a growing home for those who love to listen, to rest, and to discover hidden truths wrapped in stories. If you can, kindly help us reach our first milestone of 1,000 subscribers. Share this video with your friends, and together we'll keep these stories alive for hearts that need them. Jesus apko iska ajar dega. And as you rest here with us tonight, I'd love for you to share something simple in the comments. Tell us your name, the city you are watching from, and the time of night or day that you are listening. It's a way of connecting our voices beneath the same sky, no matter where we are. The story is calling us onward, step by step, deeper into the mystery of the first Nephilim King, born not in light, but in fire. In the beginning, the world lay in silence, vast and untouched. The earth stretched wide, wrapped in mists that hovered above rivers not yet named and forests not yet known. There were no footsteps, no voices, no laughter of children, only the low hum of creation itself. The seas swayed softly under the weight of the moon, and the winds wet, spared across mountains as though practicing a song meant for future ears. The earth was alive, but still waiting, cradled in a calm that had no measure of time. Everything existed in balance, and though it was beautiful, it was lonely. The stars above watched quietly, glimmering like scattered jewels across the endless sky. They did not blink, they did not fade, but they shimmered as if keeping a secret. Beneath them, the fields grew wild and untamed, grasses waving like a gentle ocean, while the first trees stretched toward the heavens, unaware of who would one day rest beneath their shade. Streams moved slowly, weaving patterns across the soil, their clear waters reflecting the sky's light. The earth felt like a dream, hushed and waiting, as though holding its breath for what was to come. And then, into this silence, something stirred. Not from the earth itself, but from above it. The heavens opened in ways unseen by mortal eyes, and from the darkness beyond the stars, light began to fall. It was not the light of the sun nor the glow of the moon, but something softer, quieter, as though the night sky itself had decided to descend. These were not streaks of fire, but movements like falling stars, drifting gently, carrying with them a presence that filled the stillness with awe. They were the Watchers. Heavenly beings, majestic yet calm, whose arrival touched the earth like a feather brushing against still water. Their descent was not with thunder, nor with violence, but with a grace so delicate that the earth seemed to lean in to listen. Where they landed, the air shimmered faintly, and the trees swayed as though in recognition of their arrival. They came not as conquerors, but as guardians, stepping upon the soil like guests in a holy place. The Watchers were unlike anything the earth had known. Their presence was tall, radiant, but not blinding. Their light was soft, like the last glow of the evening sky before the stars take their throne. They did not disturb the rivers, they did not crush the grasses, but moved with the harmony of the land. Some stood upon mountain peaks, gazing at the expanse of valleys beneath them. Others knelt by rivers, their reflections mingling with the waters. Their voices were not loud, yet when they spoke to one another, it was like the low hum of music that made the ground itself seem to resonate. They were watchers of what was to come, keepers of mysteries that the earth had not yet been told. Their purpose was to observe, to guide, and perhaps to wait for something even greater. For though the world was vast, it was not yet complete. The fields bore no footsteps, the winds carried no names, and the songs of the earth had no one to hear them. The Watchers, in their stillness, felt the waiting in the soil, in the sky, in the seas. Creation itself was longing for a voice to rise from within it, a being who could walk and speak and choose. Nights passed in silence. The watchers gazed upward as the constellations wheeled across the heavens. They gazed downward as rivers cut deeper paths through stone, as trees lifted their arms higher into the sky. They walked among the mountains and valleys, leaving no trace, their presence gentle but unshakable. And though they did not sleep, there was a restfulness about them, as if they carried the peace of eternity within their very being. At times, they appeared like glowing silhouettes upon ridges, faint light outlining their forms as the stars crowned the sky behind them. To see them would have been to feel a calm so deep it silenced every worry. They did not move quickly. Each gesture was patient, as if time itself flowed differently for or them. Their watch was not hurried, for they knew the world was still preparing. The earth itself seemed to respond to them. Flowers unfurled slowly as though trying to meet their gaze. Birds, few as they were in those early days, circled softly above them without fear. Even the rivers seemed to glitter more brightly where their shadows fell. They were in harmony with everything around them, as though they were both part of creation and above it, belonging to heaven but touching the soil with reverence. Still, a mystery lingered in the air. Why had they come? Why did the heavens send them to a place so silent, so untouched? They stood in patience, looking out across a world that was waiting. And in their stillness, one could sense that something more was coming, something that would fill the earth with voices, with choices, with joy and sorrow alike. The watchers did not speak of it aloud, but their eyes carried a knowing. Their gaze lingered on the soil, on the rivers, on the stars that circled endlessly above. They seemed to be waiting for footsteps, footsteps that had not yet touched the dust of the earth. For though the mountains were tall and the seas wide, though the forests were endless and the stars beyond number, there was still a silence that could only be broken by the arrival of man. Until then, they remained, glowing softly like guardians of a sleeping world. Falling stars made flesh, silent and patient in their task. And as the earth turned slowly beneath the endless sky, the watchers stood their vigil, waiting for the moment when creation's story would truly begin. The earth, once quiet in its innocence, began to change. The rivers sang louder, the forests thickened, and the sky seemed closer, as though creation itself leaned forward to watch what was unfolding. The watchers had walked among the valleys for countless nights, silent and radiant, bound by a purpose too heavy for mortal minds. They were not meant to disturb what was coming, only to observe. Yet even as they kept their vigil, their eyes often lingered too long on the fragile beauty of the earth. And slowly, a different kind of longing stirred within them, something soft, something dangerous, something forbidden. Among the hills and plains, humankind began to rise. Where once the soil had been empty, now it bore the footprints of men and women who tilled the ground, built their shelters, and kindled fires that danced against the darkness. Their voices lifted into the air, simple and unpolished, but alive. They sang lullabies to their children, whispered prayers to the heavens, and laughed beside their flames. The watchers high upon their mountains gazed down at these fragile creatures of dust and breath and felt something they had never known before. At first, it was only admiration. The daughters of men walked with grace, their hair flowing like rivers, their eyes reflecting the firelight of their homes. They were not radiant like the heavens, yet there was a warmth in them, a spark that belonged solely to earth. Their laughter drifted upward like bells on the wind, and the watchers listened with a stillness that betrayed the unrest within them. They had known beauty in the stars, in the endless dance of galaxies, but this was different. This was close. This was alive. The silence between the stars and the earth became filled with whispers. The watchers spoke to one another in hushed tones, voices carried like the sigh of the wind across fields. They questioned, weighing. Had it meant to gaze so longingly upon the children of clay? They wrestled with a pull they had never been meant to feel. For in the laws of creation, there was a boundary, invisible yet unbreakable. The heavens and the earth were to remain apart. The Watchers were guardians, not companions, but the heart, even one made of light, can be swayed when desire is kindled. Night after night, they lingered closer to the human dwellings. Their footsteps, though light as mist, carried them nearer to the fires that flickered in the darkness. They watched mothers cradle their infants, watched daughters gather water from rivers, watched families break bread together beneath the stars. And the Watchers, bound by eternity, felt time itself slip through their fingers. What was once a silent duty became an unbearable ache. They wanted more than to watch. They wanted to join. The moment came quietly, like a storm that begins as a whisper on the wind. Some of the Watchers, unable to hold back their yearning, descended not as guardians, but as seekers. Their light dimmed, softened, taking on forms that men and women could behold without fear. They stepped into villages like strangers arriving from afar, cloaked in mystery, yet burning with something both gentle and terrifying. The daughters of men looked upon them with wonder, for these beings carried a beauty that no human eyes had ever known. Their voices were like songs carried through dreams, their presence both comforting and unsettling, like standing too near to fire on a cold night. And so the boundary was crossed. What was forbidden became real. The Watchers took the daughters of men as companions, and in the quiet of the night, the union of heaven and earth unfolded in secret. The winds whispered through the trees as though carrying tales that should never be told. The rivers seemed to rush faster, disturbed by what had entered to us. He whirled. Even the stars above seemed to flicker uneasily, their endless gaze unable to look away from what was happening below. The daughters, in their innocence, did not understand the weight of this union. To them, it was as though the heavens themselves had chosen to dwell among them. They were cherished, adorned with knowledge, taught secrets of things beyond their reach. The Watchers spoke of the stars and their paths, of metals hidden beneath the mountains, of plants that healed and roots that poisoned. They gave gifts too great for human hands, knowledge that glittered like jewels but carried shadows within it. And the women, awed and grateful, held tightly to the ones who had descended for them. But the world began to feel the tremor of change. The whispers grew louder, carried through the forests, across the seas, and over the mountains. A quiet unease spread, for such unions were not meant to be. Creation had been balanced, each realm with its own place, yet now the two had mingled, and the harmony of heaven and earth had been pierced. The night air grew heavy, filled with a tension that was neither seen nor named, but felt deep within the soil itself. From these unions, life began to stir, life unlike any the earth had ever known. The wombs of women carried something vast, something towering, something that bore both the mark of earth and the fire of heaven. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their steps even before they were born, as though anticipating the weight of what was coming. It was as if the very order of the world bent beneath the consequence of desire. And still, the Watchers did not turn back. Once the boundary had been crossed, there was no return to silence, no undoing of the choices made beneath the stars. They lingered among their chosen, holding them close, whispering secrets that were never meant for mortal ears. The night winds carried the sound of their voices, dreamy and haunting, echoing across the hills where no one else could see. It was the sound of heaven, entangled with earth, soft but filled with an unease that could not be hidden. The earth lay restless beneath this union. The forests seemed darker, the seas deeper, the winds colder. Something vast had awakened, and though it was born in whispers and longing, its shadow stretched far beyond what the Watchers or the daughters of men could understand. The boundary had been crossed, and with it, the story of the world would never again be the same. The earth had already begun to feel the weight of change, but nothing prepared it for the moment when the first of the children came forth. Beneath the dim glow of the stars, in a quiet dwelling far from the sight of others, a woman labored in silence. Her cries rose softly into the night, carried by the wind as though even the air held its breath. The watcher at her side, cloaked in a form made to seem human, stood with a gaze that was both tender and troubled. He knew that what was being born was not entirely of earth, nor entirely of heaven, but something caught between the two, something the world had never seen. When the child emerged, the air around him seemed to shift. The fire in the hearth flared brighter for no reason, and shadows on the walls bent in strange, unnatural patterns. The infant's eyes opened, not with the soft haze of a newborn, but sharp, gleaming like embers in the dark. His skin bore the hue of humanity, yet it seemed to glow faintly, as though some hidden flame pulsed beneath. The mother trembled, holding him close, yet her arms felt the heat of his presence, warmth that was not of fever, but of power. She wept with wonder and fear, for she had birthed something both beautiful and terrifying. The watcher bent low, studying the child he had sown. Pride flickered across his features, but it was shadowed by unease. This was no ordinary child, no simple son of dust. The fire that lingered in his aura was a reflection of something celestial, something that had no place bound to clay. As the child cried, his voice rang unlike any newborn's, resonant, carrying a weight that echoed in the walls and even startled the animals outside the dwelling. It was as though creation itself bent to listen, trembling at the sound of something entirely new. The boy grew swiftly, his body strengthened not just by bread and water, but by a fire that seemed to live within him. Other children stumbled through their early years, fragile and slow, but he walked sooner, spoke sooner, and his gaze carried the depth of one far older than his age. His mother would often find him sitting near the flames of their fire, staring into it as though listening to voices she could not hear. When he smiled, the room brightened. When he grew angry, the hearth would roar higher, flames leaping as though stirred by his breath. Whispers spread among the villagers. They spoke of a child touched by something greater, a boy with a glow in his eyes that unsettled even the bravest men. Children were drawn to him, yet feared him at the same time, sensing a difference they could not name. His steps left a heaviness in the earth, as though the soil itself bore witness to the burden he carried. Mothers would hush their children when he passed, bowing their heads as if before something sacred yet dangerous. The watchers, too, took notice. From the mountains and the valleys, they came to glimpse the child born of their kind and of clay. Some stood in awe, whispering that this was the beginning of a new order, a being greater than men, perhaps even a king among them. Others felt a stir of dread, for they knew that Wadisiu, had been forbidden, had now given birth to a fire that could not be contained. The child was a mirror of their transgression, living proof of a boundary broken. Yet he was also a marvel, a flame clothed in flesh, destined to lead the rest that would follow. As the boy grew, so did his stature. His limbs lengthened with unusual speed, his shoulders broadened, and his voice deepened into a tone that carried far beyond the walls of their dwelling. He could lift stones that grown men struggled to move. His laughter shook the air, and his anger was like a storm. Yet he was not wild. There was a strange calm in him, a quietness that made his presence all the more commanding. When he walked, men instinctively moved aside, though he had spoken no word of command. It was as though his very being demanded reverence. His mother, though proud, feared what he was becoming. At night, she would dream of flames rising from the earth, consuming cities, and in the center stood her son, his eyes burning brighter than the fire itself. She would wake with trembling hands, clutching him tightly as though her embrace could keep him bound to the innocence of childhood. But already destiny was weaving around him, drawing him toward a throne no mortal had ever sat upon. The watchers began to gather around him, offering gifts of knowledge and strength. They taught him secrets of metal, how to draw ore from the mountain and shape it into blades sharper than bone. They whispered to him the mysteries of the stars, the paths of fire in the heavens, the hidden patterns of power that lay beneath the earth. And he listened, his young mind absorbing all as though he had been waiting since birth to hear it. Soon, he was not only strong in body, but wise in matters that no man should have known. It was then that others began to call him king, not by coronation, not by crown, but by the sheer force of his being. Men followed him instinctively, their voices bending to his command, their eyes unable to meet his for long. He needed no throne to rule. The earth itself seemed to recognize him as master. And yet, beneath his calm exterior, the fire within him grew restless, as though it longed for something greater, something beyond the reach of human lands. Animals, too, seemed to sense his difference. Lions did not flee when he approached. Wolves lingered at the edge of his steps, tails low yet unafraid. Birds circled above him, their cries echoing as if announcing his presence. The natural world, stirred by his aura, seemed both drawn and unsettled, recognizing in him a force that was neither fully of earth nor fully of heaven. But it was his eyes that told the truest tale. In moments of stillness, when the firelight reflected in them, they seemed to burn with an inner flame that never dimmed. Those who looked too long into them swore they saw visions, cities falling, seas rising, stars trembling. Some turned away in fear, while others fell to their knees, declaring him chosen, destined to lead not only men, but nations. And so, the first of the Nephilim kings rose, born of a union never meant to be, marked by fire and destined for a path that would shape the world in ways no man or watcher could yet imagine. His birth was not merely the arrival of a child, but the ignition of a flame that would burn through the ages, casting both light and shadow upon everything it touched. From the earliest days of his childhood, it became clear that he was not like the others. At first, the difference was subtle, barely noticed except by his mother, who watched him grow with both awe and dread. His body lengthened faster than the years could count, muscles forming with unnatural strength, his shoulders widening before other children had even learned to balance their own frames. By the time he could walk, he towered above boys years older than himself. Villagers who came near their dwelling would glance quickly at him, then avert their eyes, whispering when they thought the family could not hear. They spoke of his size, his piercing gaze, his aura that seemed too heavy for a child. The difference was not only in his stature. His appetite grew as swiftly as his body. What would sustain a family for days was consumed in a single sitting by the boy, his hunger gnawing at him constantly, insatiable and strange. His mother cooked without rest, gathering grain, fruit, and meat, yet still he reached for more, his eyes clouded with need that frightened her. Sometimes in the stillness of night, she found him staring at the sky, his chest rising and falling with restless breaths, as though even the stars could not satisfy the hunger that burned in his soul. Among other children, he stood apart. They shrank away from him, unsettled by his size, unnerved by the faint glow that seemed to cling to his skin in the dim light. When he tried to play, they scattered, their laughter turning to screams, leaving him alone in fields too wide and silent. Though he longed to join them, his shadow loomed too large, and fear was always stronger than friendship. He watched from a distance, heart aching with a loneliness that words could not soothe. He was different, and the world reminded him of it at every turn. Animals, however, reacted in ways that were more complicated. Dogs barked in his presence but did not approach. Horses snorted and stamped their hooves nervously when he drew near. Yet wild creatures lingered at the edges of his path. Birds circled overhead, wolves sat in the distance watching with unblinking eyes, and even lions that prowled near the hills seemed hesitant, as though they recognized something in him that was not fully of man. This strange relationship with the creatures of earth gave him a kind of silent companionship, though even this reminded him of his difference. His mother tried to shelter him, offering words of comfort, reminding him that strength was a gift and that his father, though unseen by most, was proud of him. But in her heart, fear gnawed quietly. She had seen the way men looked at her son, not with kindness, but with suspicion. They whispered that no child should grow so fast, eat so much, or carry such a presence. Some said he was cursed, others that he was touched by heaven, but all agreed that he was not like them. Mothers pulled their children closer when he passed, and fathers tightened their grip on tools that could be turned into weapons. As he grew older, his solitude deepened. At night, when the fire burned low, he would sit by its glow, staring into the flames that seemed to dance for him alone. The shadows of the room stretched longer around him, wrapping him in a cloak of silence. He thought of the laughter he heard during the day, the games of the other children, the bonds of brothers and sisters that he would never know. A heaviness pressed upon him, not just from his massive frame, but from the emptiness that lived inside, an emptiness no food or strength could fill. Sometimes he wandered alone into the hills, where he could walk freely without the weight of human eyes upon him. He would sit on the rocks, watching the world stretch out below, fields, rivers, and forests bathed in the light of the moon. In those moments, the silence was both a comfort and a wound. He belonged to none of it, yet it all seemed to belong to him. The earth felt fragile beneath his feet, and even the wind seemed to hesitate as it brushed against his towering form. The watcher who had fathered him would appear from time to time, cloaked in the semblance of man. He would speak to the bow, in hushed tones telling him that his strength was not to be hidden, that he was meant for greatness beyond what mortals could imagine. Yet even in those words, the boy felt the ache of distance. His father was not always there. He came and went like a shadow, never fully part of his world. The boy's heart longed for closeness, for the simple bond of belonging, but what he received instead were whispers of destiny and the weight of expectation. His hunger only deepened as he entered his youth. He ate what could feed a household, and still his eyes wandered to the herds in the fields, to the wild animals in the forests. The villagers noticed. They saw the vanishing stores of food, the way their animals grew restless when he passed. Fear hardened in their hearts, for they knew that a hunger like his would one day outgrow what their hands could provide. They began to avoid him openly, their voices sharp, their eyes cold, as though by rejecting him they could protect themselves from what he might one day become. Loneliness grew into something heavier. At times, anger flickered within him, a fire that matched the one burning in his blood. When he was mocked from a distance, when he felt the sting of rejection, his fists would clench, and the ground beneath him seemed to tremble faintly, as though it too felt his rage. But more often than not, he swallowed it down, turning his eyes toward the horizon, searching for a place where he might belong. And yet, despite his size, despite his hunger, despite the fear that followed him, there was a gentleness in his heart that would not die. He helped his mother with her burdens, carrying water from the river in jars that were too heavy for other men. He would leave offerings of food for stray animals, even when his own hunger gnawed at him. At night, when no one could see, he wept quietly, pressing his massive hands against his face, wishing he could be smaller, wishing he could laugh among the children without scaring them away. The world had already marked him, but in the stillness of his lonely heart, he carried a secret truth. For all his power, he was still just a child yearning for warmth, for acceptance, for the love that seemed always just beyond his reach. And though his shadow grew longer with each passing year, so too did the emptiness inside him, stretching like a hollow echo that no feast, no strength, no destiny could fill. They came from distant valleys and high mountain ridges, drawn by whispers that carried through the wind like a summons from the unseen. Giants of strange size and power, each born of forbidden blood, gathered to look upon the one who had grown taller, stronger, and more fearsome than them all. He stood above them as a tree rises above a forest, his shoulders broad as the gates of a city, his gaze burning with the light of something neither wholly mortal nor fully celestial. Though each of these beings was mighty in their own right, they felt their strength wither in his presence, as if the earth itself tilted toward him, recognizing its ruler before men dared to utter the word. At first, they tested him, for pride ran deep in their blood. They circled him in the plains, some with voices loud and mocking, others with hands clenched around stones or crude weapons. They sought to see if he would falter, if the tales of his fiery aura were only shadows spun by fearful tongues. Yet when he raised his hand, the air itself seemed to quiver. The ground shook with his step, and the sun glared like a flame behind his towering frame. In silence, they felt the weight of his being, a weight that pressed upon their chests until their defiance crumbled. One by one they lowered their heads, pride bent to power, and the first bow was followed by many more. Thus began the shaping of his throne, not by the craft of men, but by the trembling obedience of his own kind. They brought him gifts torn from the bones of the earth, slabs of black stone, veined with red like rivers of fire, and metals pulled from the mountains that gleamed with an unnatural glow. From these his seat of dominion was raised, a throne that seemed alive with light, as though embers hid within its heart. When he sat upon it, flames licked faintly along its edges, not consuming but illuminating, wrapping his figure in an otherworldly radiance. Those who looked upon him saw not only a king, but a living beacon of the forbidden union that had birthed them all. The gathering of the Nephilim became an assembly unlike any before. They knelt in rings around his throne, their massive bodies casting shadows across the land, their faces lifted toward him with awe and fear mingled together. Some beat their chests with fists the size of shields, swearing loyalty. Others offered blood from their hunts, laying down beasts too large for ordinary men to imagine. In this submission, they acknowledged what had long been whispered in secret. Among the giants, one now stood as king. His name was spoken not in defiance, but in reverence, the sound rolling across the land like distant thunder. But kingship was not only a gift, it was a burden. He felt the weight of their eyes, the endless hunger of their spirits, the need for someone to guide the chaos that burned in their veins. They looked to him not merely as a leader, but as the embodiment of their strength, the proof that their kind was destined for greatness. He knew this throne of fire was more than a seat. It was a chain, binding him to the destiny his father had whispered of in shadowed meetings. The crown upon his head was invisible, yet its pressure never left him. He rose from his throne often, not content to sit in idleness. His steps became the march of an army, and the Nephilim followed like storms follow the wind. Villages fell silent when his shadow passed, their people hiding in trembling clusters, praying that their crops, their animals, their lives would not be claimed as tribute. Sometimes he accepted offerings left at the edges of fields, grain, wine, or livestock left trembling in pens. Other times his hunger demanded more, and the cries of men and women joined the night air, carried across the hills like mournful songs. Yet even in his fearsome rise, there was a strange kind of majesty. He ruled not with petty cruelty, but with the inevitability of a mountain standing before the plain. The other Nephilim obeyed him because his presence left no room for doubt. Around his throne they built halls of stone, walls adorned with carvings that told the story of their birth and his ascension. Torches burned endlessly in these halls, their flames reflecting against his throne of fire, making it appear as though he sat in the very heart of the sun. There were nights when the firelight dimmed and the giants whispered among themselves, wondering if his strength came from his father's blood or from some deeper flame that none of them could name. They spoke of his eyes that glowed faintly in the dark, of his voice that could silence even the roaring of beasts. To them, he was more than a king. He was a bridge between their shadowed existence and the powers above the heavens. Fear of him became worship, and worship became law. His mother, aged by sorrow and solitude, watched from the edges of this rising dominion. She remembered the boy who once wept in silence by the fire, lonely despite his strength. Now, when she saw him seated upon the throne of burning stone, surrounded by creatures who bowed at his feet, she wondered if the child within him had vanished or merely been buried beneath the weight of crowns and the adoration of giants. Though she never spoke it aloud, she feared that the loneliness of his heart had transformed into something far more dangerous, a hunger not only for food, but for power that would never be satisfied. The Watchers looked upon his reign with quiet pride and darker intentions. They saw in him the fruition of their rebellion, a being who embodied the mingling of heaven's strength and earth's flesh. In his kingship, they glimpsed the possibility of dominion over the world of men. And though they did not sit upon his throne, their shadows lingered near, whispering into his heart, reminding him that his rise was only the beginning. As he sat in the glow of fire, surrounded by the bowed heads of those who were once his equals, the night itself seemed to bend around him. Stars shivered above, clouds gathered low, and the wind grew hushed, as though creation itself recognized that a new order had been forged. He, the child of flame, had become more than a giant. He was now the crowned ruler of his kind, and the earth trembled beneath his reign. The city rose from the earth as though it had been sleeping in silence for 1,000 years, waiting for the hands of giants to awaken it. It was not built in the manner of men, with timbers cut and fitted, nor with bricks stacked one upon another. It was carved, hewn directly into the body of mountains and stone cliffs, as though the Nephilim had peeled back the flesh of the world and revealed its bones. Walls did not rise, they emerged. Towers did not reach, they were drawn forth from the heart of the rock itself. Every structure bore the weight of permanence, each corner sharp, each surface scarred with the strokes of colossal hands that had carved without pause. And yet, though it was immense, the city seemed to breathe with a stillness unlike any dwelling of man. By day, its presence was terrible and overwhelming, a monument that cast shadows across valleys and rivers. But by night, the city became something else, something dreamlike, almost unreal. The torches set within its great walls flickered like faint stars, their light swallowed by the immensity of the stone. Shadows stretched across avenues wide enough for armies to march through, and silence filled the air as though the city itself hushed the world around it. No birds dared to circle above, no insect crawled across its stones. The silence was so complete that even the sound of breathing seemed like an intrusion. It was a silence not of emptiness, but of weight, a silence that pressed upon the spirit as if the city itself demanded reverence. The Nephilim walked its streets in the dimness of the night, their vast forms half concealed by shadow. Their footsteps did not echo as one might expect from such size. Instead, the sound was absorbed by the stone, as if the city was drinking in the noise, refusing to let it leave. The air itself seemed heavy, filled with the scent of smoke from their endless fires, the iron tang of blood from their hunts, and the faint sweetness of crushed herbs burned in rituals that only they understood. Torches were mounted in sconces carved into the rock, their flames casting long, trembling figures along the walls. In those wavering shapes, one might almost think the stone itself was alive, bending and shifting in secret. The city had no gates in the manner of men. Instead, archways had been hollowed out from sheer cliffs, their edges marked by carvings of twisted figures and beings half human, half bestial. These entrances were not made to welcome, but to intimidate. Passing beneath them felt like stepping into a different world, one that obeyed rules foreign to ordinary life. Once within, there was no sound of trade, no market cries, no laugh, tir or chatter. Only the low murmur of voices too deep for human throats, and the rustling of enormous bodies moving in the darkness. The city did not bustle, it brooded. In the heart of this carved silence lay the throne hall, where the king of the Nephilim sat upon his seat of fire. The hall was vast beyond measure, so large that even the tallest trees of the forests could have been placed within without touching the ceiling. Its roof was the living stone of the mountain itself, carved with strange symbols that no man could read. In the dim glow of scattered flames, these carvings caught light and seemed to shimmer faintly, as though remembering the hands of the watchers who had taught their children how to shape such things. Before the throne stretched a floor polished until it gleamed like black glass, reflecting the fire's glow, so that the king appeared to sit upon a sea of burning light. Around the throne, shadows gathered. The Nephilim did not decorate their hall with gold or jewels, for such things seemed trivial to them. Instead, they placed bones, colossal rib cages of beasts now extinct, skulls with horns that curled like rivers, tusks the length of ships. To walk through the hall was to walk through a graveyard of wonders, each relic a reminder of hunts that shook the earth. The silence of the hall was broken only when the king spoke, his voice low, yet carrying like thunder, rolling through caverns. The streets leading outward from the throne hall were lined with monolithic structures. Some were dwellings, though their scale would have swallowed entire human villages within. Others seemed to serve no purpose at all, their interiors hollow, their walls etched with labyrinthine designs. Men who glimpsed them from afar whispered that these were places of ritual, chambers where shadows danced against the stone in the flicker of torchlight, and strange voices rose, in chants that sounded like wind groaning through mountains. Whatever their use, they stood in the stillness of the city like sentinels, their silence unbroken. At night, the city seemed to hum with a sound too low for human ears, a vibration that lived in the stone itself. Those who camped beyond its walls sometimes woke in terror, claiming they had felt the earth beneath them tremble with a heartbeat. Others swore they heard whispers echoing across the cliffs, voices too deep to belong to any man, voices that came not from throats, but from the walls themselves. Travelers who drew near spoke of dreams that haunted them, dreams of endless corridors, of stairways carved into darkness, of eyes burning faintly in the shadows. And yet, despite its dread, the city possessed a strange beauty. By moonlight, its towers rose like black pillars against the sky, their surfaces gleaming silver where the stone caught the pale light. Water trickled down from hidden springs, glimmering in narrow channels carved along the streets, flowing silently through the heart of the city like veins of liquid glass. The fires that burned in the halls reflected against these streams, so that in some places it seemed as though rivers of flame wound between the structures. In the stillness, one might almost believe it was a city caught between worlds, suspended between dream and waking. The Nephilim who dwelt within did not sing songs nor carve tales of joy into their walls. Their carvings were grim, depicting battles, beasts, and the faces of men crying out in terror. These images stretched along walls and doorways, capturing stories of violence as though violence itself was their language. Yet beneath the horror, there was also reverence, for the images always circled back to their king, the child of flame, the crowned giant who sat upon his throne of fire. His likeness was etched into countless stones, his towering figure made eternal by their hands, so that even in shadow his presence ruled the city. For those who dared to look upon it, the city was both nightmare and wonder. It seemed alive, as though the stones still remembered the chisels that had carved it, as though the silence itself was a presence watching from every darkened corner. And in that silence, the Nephilim thrived, moving like phantoms through the dreamlike glow of fire and moon, building a dominion that was both fortress and tomb. It was not a city made for laughter or light, but for shadow and memory, a monument carved in silence where the breath of giants lingered forever in the stone. The hall stretched endlessly, a cavern of stone lit by the glow of countless torches. Flames burned in iron bowls affixed to the walls, their light wavering across carvings of beasts and battles etched into the rock. Smoke rose in thin ribbons toward the ceiling high above, where it pooled like a storm cloud and lingered. The air was heavy, thick with the mingled scents of roasted flesh, spiced herbs crushed beneath colossal hands, and the musk of the Nephilim themselves. Long tables of stone had been carved directly from the mountain floor, their surfaces polished until they reflected the orange glow of firelight. Upon these tables lay an abundance of food, but it was not the food of ordinary feasts. The carcasses of oxen and stags, of wild boar and strange beasts dragged from the forests, lay heaped in piles, their bones jutting from the flesh. Fishes longer than a man sprawled across platters, their scales glistening like silver in the fire. Jars of wine, each the size of barrels, stood uncorked, the crimson liquid spilling across the stone like blood. The giants entered with a thunder of footsteps, their shadows stretching enormous upon the walls. They did not slip quietly into their places, but claimed them with the weight of their presence, shoulders brushing against the towering pillars, laughter like rolling thunder echoing in the chamber. When they sat, the stone itself seemed to shudder beneath them, and their great hands reached across the tables to tear into the food with little restraint. They ate not with delicacy, but with hunger that spoke of their endless might, tearing flesh with their teeth, snapping bones as though they were twigs. Each bite was a display of strength, each swallow a reminder of their appetite for dominance as much as for sustenance. Among them moved the servants, men and women of smaller frame, trembling beneath the shadows of their masters, carried trays that seemed far too heavy for human hands. Their faces were pale, their eyes fixed downward, lest they draw the gaze of those who dined. They poured wine into massive cups carved from horn and stone, their arms quivering under the weight. They dragged carcasses forward on sledges, straining until their muscles trembled, then stepped back quickly, retreating into the darkness at the edges of the hall. No laughter escaped their lips. No whispers passed between them. They moved in silence, shadows among the shadows, aware that one misstep, one clumsy motion, might end their lives in an instant. The giants paid them little heed, save when their service faltered. Then a hand might slam down upon the table with the force of a falling boulder, and the hall would tremble. Sometimes a laugh would follow, deep and cruel, and a trembling servant would find themselves lifted into the air, their feet kicking helplessly above the ground. Rarely did such displays end kindly. To the Nephilim, men were tools, vessels to bring them food and wine, little more than moving shadows whose worth was measured by obedience and silence. And yet, the presence of these fragile servants made the feast more complete, for the giants delighted in being served by those so small, their power reflected in the trembling fear that clung to every human face. The sound of the feast was a storm of its own. Bones cracked loudly, echoing against the walls. Cups clashed together in toasts that shook the table. Laughter rumbled, a sound too deep for ordinary ears, vibrating through the stone floor. Their speech was thick, guttural, spoken in tongues passed down from the watchers, words that seemed to growl and roar with every syllable. When they raised their voices together, the hall shook as though the mountain itself were answering. Firelight flickered across their faces, illuminating eyes that glowed faintly, eyes that carried both hunger and arrogance. At the head of the feast, upon a raised platform of stone, sat the crowned giant, the king whose throne was fire. His place was not a chair, but a seat carved directly from the rock, its surface etched with flames that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. Before him lay an offering larger than any other, a bull of immense size, roasted whole, its skin charred and its flesh steaming. Servants stood in line before him, carrying great knives of bronze, slicing the beast into slabs that dripped with juices, then lifting them with trembling arms to place upon his table. He ate slowly, not with the reckless hunger of those below, but with a measured dominance, each bite a proclamation of his power. The others watched him, their own feasting a reflection of his authority. Music rose in the hall, not the sweet melodies of human gatherings, but the deep, booming rhythm of drums carved from the hides of great beasts. Horns made from tusks were blown, their sound echoing like the calls of ancient spirits across the mountains. The giants swayed to this music, their massive bodies moving with a force that made the torches flicker and the tables groan. Some rose to wrestle in the open spaces of the hall, grappling with each other in displays of strength that sent stone chips flying when their bodies struck the floor. Their laughter was wild, their voices rising like storms as they cheered one another on. Through it all, the humans kept their silence. They stood at the edges of the hall, pressed against the walls, their eyes fixed upon the ground. Some held trays, others pitchers, waiting for the moment they would be summoned. The fear in their faces was plain, yet so too was resignation, for they had lived too long beneath the shadow of giants to believe escape possible. Now and then a servant was seized, drawn into the circle of revelry, not as guest but as spectacle. A giant might lift one aloft, their small body dwarfed by the massive hand that held them, laughter booming as others reached to poke and prod. Some were forced to pour wine directly into the mouths of their masters, clinging desperately to the cups lest they spill. Others, less fortunate, became part of the feast in a way too dreadful for words, their screams quickly swallowed by the thunderous cheer of the hall. The firelight glowed hotter as the night wore on, the air thick with smoke and heat. Sweat glistened on the giant's skin, their muscles gleaming as they roared and ate and drank without end. The ground was slick with spilled wine and blood, a mingling of crimson that stained the polished stone. The music grew faster, drums beating like the heartbeat of the earth itself, horns blaring until the walls shook. The feast became frenzy, a storm of sound and light, as though the hall itself had become a furnace of power and hunger. And still, the silence of the servants endured. They moved quietly among the shadows, refilling cups, dragging bones away, gathering scraps too large for human hands. Their eyes never lifted, their lips never parted, for silence was their shield. Yet in that silence, in the trembling of their limbs, lay the reflection of what the Nephilim valued most: dominion, the unquestioned supremacy of those who feasted while others bent and trembled in their presence. The Feast of the Mighty was not merely a gathering for food and drink. It was a ceremony of power, a declaration carved in flame and shadow that giants ruled the earth, and that all who entered their hall did so with bowed heads and silenced tongues. The nights were never quiet in those days, for when the torches burned low and the wind moved through the valleys, voices carried on the air, voices not belonging to men. They were not shouts or cries, but melodies, drifting like whispers from the high places, songs that seemed at once to soothe and unsettle. Men who had wandered too close to the mountains where the watchers descended often spoke of these sounds, describing them as lullabies that made the heart ache, sweet enough to pull the soul into stillness, yet woven with tones that stirred unease, as though danger hid beneath their softness. These were the songs of the watchers, the fallen ones who had abandoned their place in the heavens and walked among the children of earth. They gathered with men under the cloak of darkness, their presence clothed not in thunder but in stillness, a calm that disarmed the spirit. They came with voices that did not command but coaxed, teaching through rhythm and tone, making secrets seem like gifts. To hear them was to be undone, for the watchers knew how to bend words into music, how to lace truth with temptation until it slid into the heart without resistance. They spoke of stars, not as mere points of light, but as gates and pathways, each one a fire set in place by hands unseen. They described the courses of the constellations, the hidden movements of the heavens, the measure of time itself etched across the sky. To men who had known only the soil beneath their feet and the cycles of the sun, such knowledge was a wonder beyond measure, and they listened as children do to a mother's song. Yet the songs carried more than the turning of stars. They whispered of metals buried deep within the mountains, veins of brightness waiting to be pulled from the earth. They told how to smelt and shape them, how to sharpen them into blades that could cut through flesh and bone, how to fashion ornaments that gleamed like the fires above. The rhythm of their voices wrapped such teachings in beauty, so that men did not see the weight of what they were learning, only the brilliance it promised. In the light of day, when the fires cooled and the tools shone in men's hands, it was too late to unhear the lullaby that had carried the secrets into their souls. The women, too, heard songs that were not meant for them. The watchers taught them the weaving of enchantments, the mixing of roots and herbs to create potions that dulled pain or sharpened desire. They whispered of mirrors polished so smooth that one could see beyond the present, of powders that gleamed like stars and drew the gaze of men. These lessons came not in stir, in command, but in a voice as gentle as night rain, every phrase a caress. To those who heard, it felt like a gift of beauty, a chance to touch the eternal. Yet beneath the softness lay a shadow, for what was taught bound them closer to the ones who taught it, until their lives no longer belonged wholly to themselves. The songs of the night spread far, reaching camps and villages beyond the mountains. Those who first heard them carried fragments of the melodies back with them, humming soft phrases to their kin, repeating the secrets they had learned with pride. Soon fires burned brighter in the homes of men as new crafts took form. Weapons glinted where once only stones had been wielded. Painted eyes shone with colors drawn from the earth. The stars themselves were charted on parchment and stone, their patterns mapped with care. Men marveled at their newfound knowledge, never questioning the cost, for the lullabies had hidden it too well. But not all who listened found peace in what they heard. Some, in the stillness after the voices faded, lay awake with unease pressing upon their hearts. They spoke of hearing notes beneath the sweetness, tones that vibrated like the hum of a storm waiting to break. They said the melodies clung to their dreams, carrying visions of things not yet seen, cities rising in smoke, blood soaking into the ground, the cries of men drowned by the laughter of giants. To others, these warnings were madness dismissed with a wave. Yet those who felt the shadows within the songs knew that danger had been seated among them, wrapped in lullabies too beautiful to resist. The watchers themselves seemed almost tender in the way they taught, though their eyes burned with a light that betrayed another nature. They never raised their voices. They never forced men to hear. Instead, they beckoned, their presence a quiet invitation, their words flowing like streams in the dark. They leaned close when they spoke, their voices low, almost like the breath of sleep, weaving mysteries into the ears of those who dared to linger. It was in this gentleness that their power lay, for men did not fear them as they should have. They trusted, lulled into the belief that no harm could come from such quiet songs. Even the children were not untouched. Some nights, when the fires dimmed, little ones woke to hear voices outside their tents, soft as their mothers but layered with something unearthly. They would slip outside, eyes wide with wonder, and stand transfixed under the stars as the melodies flowed around them. They returned to their beds with words upon their lips they could not explain, humming songs that were not of their people. Parents dismissed it as dreaming, yet unease grew in the eyes of those who listened closely, for the songs of the children carried echoes of something not born of earth. The night itself seemed to change beneath these teachings. The stars no longer shone as simple fires in the distance, but as doors waiting to be opened. The earth no longer seemed only soil and stone, but a vault filled with secrets waiting to be uncovered. Men who once lived with simplicity now felt a hunger stir within them, a hunger for power, for knowledge beyond what their fathers had known. And though the hunger was gentle at first, clothed in beauty, it carried with it the shadow of what was yet to come. The songs of the watchers lingered long after the voices ceased. They wove themselves into the rhythms of daily life, into the striking of hammers agad, Inced metal, the grinding of herbs, the marking of stars. They lingered in the whispers of women painting their eyes with strange powders, in the laughter of men sharpening blades beneath the moon. They lingered in the silence of those who lay awake at night, unable to rest, haunted by melodies that promised wonders yet dripped with unease. And though men could not yet name it, something had shifted, as though a door had opened in the world, and through it a new shadow had begun to creep. The ground had grown heavy beneath the weight of men, as if every footfall pressed sorrow into the soil. Where once the earth had known only the quiet rhythm of herds moving over green valleys and the soft touch of rain, she now bore the scars of endless struggle. Fields that had yielded fruit without striving were trampled beneath the feet of the mighty. Forests that once whispered with life now stood broken, their trunks split for fires that burned through the night. The air carried not only the smoke of torches, but the sound of anguish, for violence had become the tongue of men and giants alike, and the world was forced to listen. Rivers, once clear as glass, now swelled with the stains of conflict. They wound through the valleys like serpents, but their waters carried a hue that spoke of pain. Villages that had rested along their banks no longer sang with the laughter of children drawing water. Instead, the streams echoed with silence broken only by sobs. Fish drifted lifeless near the surface, their scales dulled by the shadows of what the waters carried. It was said by those who dared to linger that the rivers themselves groaned as they moved, that their rushing no longer sang but mourned. To the weary who came to drink, it felt as though the very earth was weeping through the veins of water. Blood had mingled with the dust, and the dust remembered. Each drop that struck the soil sank deep, leaving marks no rain could wash away. Men fought not only against beasts or against strangers, but against their own kin, driven by pride, envy, and the whispers of power the Watchers had left behind. The giants strode among them, towering shadows whose strength turned quarrels into ruin. A single strike from their hands could scatter men like leaves, and yet they did not relent, for their hunger for dominion was endless. Where they feasted, famine followed. Where they walked, fields lay barren, and where they clashed, the ground itself seemed to tremble. The cries of the earth rose in places unseen, in caverns where roots stretched deep, in the hollow chambers of mountains. There, it was said, the ground whispered laments, as if the world itself could feel the wounds laid upon it. The forests no longer sang with birds at dawn. Their branches creaked under the weight of silence. Creatures once gentle turned against one another, as if the violence of man had seeped into their bones. Even the night, once a shelter of rest, grew restless, filled with distant wails and echoes that made the heart shiver. The sorrow of the world clung to every place. Farmers, when they placed their hands upon the soil, felt not the usual promise of harvest, but a heaviness, as though the ground recoiled beneath their touch. Mothers, when they carried their children near the rivers, wept without knowing why, for the waters seemed to carry grief into their hearts. Hunters in the forest heard not the crackle of leaves alone, but the sighs of something greater, as though the earth herself had become a mourner draped in shadow. The giants, in their pride, did not notice the sorrow they carved into the land. Their feasts were loud, their halls filled with firelight, and the sound of their revelry rose, above the cries of the weak. Yet outside their stone cities, the ground bore the marks of their cruelty. Paths once green became darkened with ash. Valleys that had been gardens lay desolate, the soil overworked and bleeding from the weight of endless hunger. The air itself carried the residue of sorrow, thick and heavy, wrapping itself around the lungs of those who breathed. And still, men did not cease. They raised their blades against one another, learned from the songs of the Watchers how to strike deeper, how to wound more sharply. Their rage was no longer wild but sharpened into craft, honed like the tools forged in fire. Brothers turned against brothers, clans against clans, and the ground drank what fell from their struggles. The more it drank, the more it groaned, until those who were silent enough could hear the low hum of mourning beneath their feet. The rivers grew swollen with sorrow, overflowing their banks as though unable to contain what had been poured into them. They flooded fields and homes, carrying not only mud, but memories of what had been lost. The people who lived along their edges whispered that the waters wept with them, that when they tasted the river, it was not merely water that touched their lips, but salt, as though the earth herself had dissolved her tears into the stream. Children cried in their sleep, restless even when held close, for the grief of the world seeped into dreams. Some woke with visions of fields aflame, of shadows striding across the hills, of skies darkened with storms that refused to lift. Elders spoke softly of days when the ground had been a friend, when the rivers had sung sweetly and the forests had sheltered them without fear. They shook their heads as they gazed upon the present, unable to reconcile the land they remembered with the one that now moaned beneath their feet. In secret, some placed their ears to the earth, listening for what the soil had to say. What they heard was not silence, but a low throb, like the pulse of grief running through the world. It was not a voice, but a weight, pressing upon the heart until tears flowed without command. They rose from the ground with faces pale, unable to explain the sorrow that had filled them, only knowing they had shared in the lament of something far greater than themselves. Night after night, the weeping did not cease. The stars looked down, cold and distant, unmoved by the suffering below. The moon, veiled by clouds, gave little light to ease the darkness. Only the earth bore witness, her soil soaked with grief, her rivers swollen with sorrow, her air heavy with mourning. Those who still had hearts to feel began to realize that they were not merely living upon the world, but wounding it, striking at its very soul. The ground beneath them was not stone alone, but a mother undone by the violence of her children, her tears hidden in every stream, her cries buried in every hollow wind. And so the world carried the weight of men and giants alike, silent and enduring, weeping without voice. Every drop of blood spilled, every echo of rage, every broken field and drowned valley joined the lament. The earth bore it all, her sorrow vast as the sky, her tears endless as the rivers. And though her voice was hushed, those who listened closely could not mistake it. The world itself was crying, mourning the shadow that had taken hold of her children. The throne was not carved from wood, nor forged from cold stone, but from a material that seemed alive with flame. Its surface glowed as though it had been hewn from the heart of a burning mountain, its heat rolling outward in waves that made even the bravest draw back. Upon this seat of fire sat the king, a figure whose presence bent the will of those round him. His eyes burned with the same consuming light as the throne itself, and the air quivered when he raised his hand, for all who looked upon him knew he ruled not through love nor wisdom, but through terror. The hall that surrounded him was vast, lined with towering pillars that bore the marks of heat. Their surfaces were scorched black, cracked and flaking from years of being licked by flames that spilled from the throne. Above, the ceiling was lost in smoke, shadows shifting against the beams as though the very structure was alive and restless. Torches burned along the walls, but their glow was pale compared to the seat of the king, which lit the room in flickering fire. Servants kept their distance, heads bowed, for none dared to lift their eyes toward the figure who ruled them. To gaze too long was to invite wrath, and wrath from this ruler came swiftly, like lightning striking dry earth. Outside the hall, the valleys stretched wide and low, green once, but now dulled beneath a veil of ash. The fires of the throne had spread farther than the stone walls of the court. They had crawled through the forests, climbed the hills, and seeped into the very soil. Where the light of fire touched, shadows deepened. In the villages scattered through the valleys, people lived beneath a cloud of dread, their lives marked by silence and the careful avoidance of notice. They did not speak loudly, nor laugh freely, for fear their joy would be seen as defiance. Fear had become the air they breathed, wrapping itself around them until it seeped into their bones. Messengers came and went, their faces set like stone, bearing commands from the burning seat. Taxes heavier than the earth itself were demanded, tributes gathered not only in grain and livestock, but in sons and daughters. The people gave because they had no choice, their eyes hollow as they led their children toward the gates. Those who resisted were brought before the throne, their fate made into a spectacle. From his fiery seat, the king decreed judgment without hesitation. Mercy was a word long forgotten. Those condemned felt the heat of the flames before they felt the edge of steel, and their cries rose into the smoke above, vanishing as quickly as they came. The king's cruelty was not content with the obedience of men. He desired fear as his true tribute, and so he built his rule upon it. His throne room was adorned not with treasures or banners, but with reminders of his power. Bones carved into shapes lined the base of the fiery seat, shadows dancing across them whenever the flames swelled. The scent of smoke and char hung constantly in the air, clinging to the garments of all who entered, so that even when they left, the weight of his presence followed them home. In every valley, in every hut, in every whisper at night, the shadow of the burning throne lingered. The giants who served him did so with grim loyalty, towering figures who walked like moving walls through the streets. Their eyes held no kindness, only the reflection of fire. They carried out the king's commands with a silence more terrifying than rage, dragging men from their homes, stamping out the smallest signs of rebellion. When they stood guard beside the throne, their massive forms flickered with the light of the flames, making them seem as though they too were creatures of fire. Their shadows stretched across the floor, reaching toward the cowering servants like claws. Beyond the throne, the land itself bore marks of the king's dominion. The fields, once lush with harvest, now yielded bitter crops. The soil had grown weary, drained by endless demands, and the rivers that wound through the valleys seemed sluggish, their waters carrying a faint taste of ash. Cattle lowed weakly in the pastures, their ribs showing beneath their hides. Children grew pale and thin, their laughter silenced by hunger and dread. Even the wind, which once carried the scent of flowers from the hills, now swept through the valleys with the acrid tang of smoke. At night, the fire of the throne could be seen from far away, its glow rising above the mountains like a beacon of despair. Those who saw it in the distance turned their faces quickly, for they did not wish to be reminded that their lives rested beneath its reach. Parents told their children to hush their cries, whispering that the fire might hear them, that the king might know. The stars themselves seemed dimmer, swallowed by the constant smoke, and the moon's pale light was often veiled, as though even the heavens had hidden their faces. The king sat with stillness, his form unmoving upon the burning seat, yet his presence pressed outward like heat radiating from flame. He did not need to rise or speak often. His silence was command enough. The people had grown so accustomed to fear that they obeyed before his words were spoken, their spirits broken into submission. To them, he was not merely a man, but a force, a fire that consumed whatever it touched. His throne, alive with flame, was not only a seat of power but a symbol of their bondage, a reminder that the fire could spread to them at any moment. Yet even the fire cast shadows, and those shadows stretched long across the valleys. Whispers stirred among the oppressed, hushed voices that dared not speak loudly, but carried the memory of days before the burning throne. They spoke of the time when the earth had not trembled under cruelty, when laughter was not a danger, when the rivers sang sweetly and the valleys thrived. These whispers were fragile, like sparks in a storm, easily crushed by the wind of fear. Still, they persisted, hidden in the quiet corners of huts, murmured in the dark when all others slept. The king, from his fiery seat, seemed unshaken by such whispers, or perhaps he knew and did not care. His cruelty was his crown, and fear his kingdom. To him, every shadow was a servant, every silence an offering. The valleys bent beneath his rule, their backs bowed, their voices hushed. And above it all, The throne burned, its flames licking higher, casting light that blinded rather than guided, heat that destroyed rather than warmed. It was not a seat of justice nor wisdom, but of unyielding fire, and from it the king ruled, while the valleys below sank deeper into shadow. When the fire of day sank beneath the horizon and the last embers of the sun dissolved into shadow, the earth grew quiet in a way that felt heavy with longing. Villages nestled in the valleys became dim pockets of silence, their roofs black against the faint light of the stars. It was in these hours that voices rose, not in defiance, but in trembling supplication. The people whispered into the night, their prayers so soft they seemed like breaths fading into the wind. They did not dare speak loudly, for fear traveled with the air, and even words could betray them. Their whispers were not filled with strength but with weakness, the kind born from hearts pressed beneath sorrow, yet still reaching upward. Mothers knelt beside beds of straw, their hands folded tightly as they leaned over their children. Their prayers were hushed, weaving through the silence like threads of smoke. They asked for safety through the dark, for dreams untainted by terror, for one more day of breath in a world that grew heavier with each dawn. Fathers prayed with their heads bowed low, their voices rasping with weariness. They did not ask for riches or for power, only for mercy, for the weight to lessen, for the cruelty above to pass over their homes without noticing. In the weak glow of oil lamps, their shadows stretched long upon the walls, figures bent and small, their whispers rising like fragile sparks toward a sky too distant to answer quickly. The earth seemed to listen with them, as though the soil itself shared in their sorrow. The ground was cracked in places where crops had failed, and yet the villagers pressed their knees into it, their tears darkening the dust. Their words blended with the quiet rustle of leaves and the sigh of rivers that had thinned from drought, as though all of creation mourned with them. The night air carried these prayers upward, mingling with the stars, which blinked faintly through veils of smoke. In those moments, heaven felt near yet far, as if listening but waiting, holding its breath. Children too whispered their own simple prayers. Their voices were thinner, softer, asking not for freedom or justice, but for warmth, for bread, for the comfort of their mother's arms, to remain another day. Their prayers were sometimes laced with fear of shadows at the door or the looming figures of giants in the streets. Yet even in their fragility, the prayers carried a purity, as though innocence itself stretched upward in fragile hope. A child's whisper could sound like music, faint but piercing, weaving into the quiet chorus of the weak. The sick prayed from their mats, their bodies too frail to rise. Their breaths rattled with each word, their eyes fixed not on the fire that glowed in the distance, but on the unseen. They whispered for healing, for release, for an end to suffering. Their voices often wavered, breaking into silence as though each phrase cost them too much strength, yet still they lifted their words upward. In huts dim with smoke and the faint scent of burning wood, their prayers lingered long after their lips had fallen still. The valleys carried these whispers together, so that though each prayer was spoken in secret, it became part of something larger. 1,000 hushed voices, scattered yet united, drifted upward in waves through the night. They did not meet in assembly, for gathering was dangerous. Instead, the unity came from the silence between words, from the shared knowledge that all were kneeling, somewhere unseen, whispering into the same vast darkness. It was a chorus born not of strength, but of frailty, and in that frailty lay its strange power. The contrast between their weakness and the fire above them was stark. In the distance, the throne still burned, casting its cruel glow across the land. Its flames licked upward, fierce and unrelenting, a symbol of power that sought to smother all who lived beneath it. Yet against this roaring fire, the whispers of the weak rose like threads of mist. They did not roar back, nor try to match the thunder of cruelty. They only lifted softly, patiently, with trembling persistence. The fire ruled the earth, but the whispers reached for heaven. The prayers were woven with memory as much as longing. Old songs, half forgotten, were murmured in fragments. Songs of ancestors who once walked with light instead of fear, songs that carried promises spoken long before the fire claimed the valleys. These fragments, spoken softly at night, became reminders to the heart, anchors in the storm of despair. A mother humming to her child might recall a verse of hope, her voice so faint it seemed only the stars could hear. An old man, too frail to stand, might mouth words he had learned in his youth, words that told of a day when justice would come. Though weak, these remnants of faith lived on in their whispers. Even the animals seemed to join in the quiet lament. Dogs lay still at the doors, their ears drooping as though they, too, carried sorrow. Birds, once lively, now sang no midnight songs, their silence blending into the mourning of the earth. The rivers whispered faintly over stones, as though echoing the prayers of those who knelt beside them. It was as if creation itself bent low, waiting, yearning with the people. In some huts, prayers turned to weeping. The weak did not always have words, and sometimes their tears became their only language. Yet even these tears carried meaning, falling to the ground like offerings. The earth drank them in, and the silence of night carried them upward with the whispered pleas. For those too broken to form words, their sobs became prayer enough, and though no one spoke, heaven seemed to lean close to the sound. The nights stretched long, yet these whispers filled them. In their weakness, the people did not shout or demand, for they knew their voices could not overpower the throne's fire. Instead, they entrusted their cries into the quiet, believing that even the faintest whisper might reach the ear of the unseen. The contrast was vast. One man sitting upon flame, his cruelty loud and consuming, and countless weak souls kneeling in the dust, their prayers almost invisible. Yet invisible things have a way of moving mountains, and so they whispered on, night after night, sending their frail words upward into the great silence where mercy might one day awaken. When the darkness pressed heavily upon the valleys and the glow of cruelty seemed endless, there came one who did not bow beneath it. His steps were steady, and his face carried a light not born of fire or shadow, but of something far more ancient. Enoch walked among the people, yet he was not bound by the weight that bent their shoulders. His presence seemed to part the gloom, for when he passed, it was as if the night itself held its breath. He did not stride with power, nor stand as one enthroned. Rather, he moved with a quietness that felt eternal, and in that quietness was strength beyond measure. The people spoke of him in whispers at first, for they could not explain the light that clung to him. His garments caught the faint shimmer of the stars, as though the heavens themselves had lent him their glow. His eyes, calm and deep, seemed to hold visions too vast for ordinary men. Visions that stretched beyond the cruelty of kings and the fear of giants. Children would watch him from doorways, sensing no danger in him, only a calmness that eased their restless dreams. Elders leaned forward when he spoke, their hearts stirred by words that reminded them of promises long buried in the dust. Enoch's walk was not hurried, for he carried no fear of the throne that burned in the distance. Each step seemed in rhythm with something unseen, as though he walked not merely upon the earth but beside one who could not be seen with mortal eyes. Those who followed behind him noticed how even the ground seemed different where his feet had touched, softer, as if refreshed. Trees bent gently toward him, and rivers seemed to quiet their rushing as he passed, as though all creation recognized in him a harmony it had nearly forgotten. His words were not like the decrees of rulers, which thundered with cruelty and demanded obedience. Instead, his voice carried the softness of a dream. Yet, every phrase lingered in the mind like fire that does not fade. He spoke of a path unseen, of a way that lifted beyond despair. He warned gently, not with threats but with sorrow, describing what lay ahead if the hearts of men remained turned toward violence and cruelty. His warnings echoed not like commands, but like songs drifting through the night, melodies that stirred the soul and awakened longing. At night, when the people whispered their prayers into the darkness, They sometimes heard his voice among them, speaking words that seemed to rise with theirs. His prayers were not louder, but they carried upward with a clarity that made the air tremble. It was as if his whispers reached past the stars, touching the one who listened from beyond. The people did not understand fully, yet they felt comforted, for they knew that at least one walked so closely with heaven that their cries could not be ignored. Visions surrounded him, drifting into his speech like fragments of dreams. He spoke of towers rising too high, of giants who would fall, of waters that would cleanse the earth. He saw beyond the cruelty of the throne, beyond the shadows that covered the valleys. His eyes, though gentle, seemed to pierce through time itself, glimpsing a future not yet born. These visions unsettled some, but they carried a beauty that could not be denied. Even when his warnings described sorrow, there was a thread of light woven through them, as though hope itself refused to be silenced. Sometimes he would stand upon a hill as the moonlight bathed him in silver, and there he would lift his hands as though greeting the heavens. Those who watched from below swore that the stars brightened above him, aligning themselves like sentinels around their companion. He did not boast of this closeness, nor did he use it to demand reverence. He simply walked on, speaking when moved, silent when word, as were not needed, carrying with him the nearness of the divine like a cloak unseen. Enoch's presence was a contrast so stark to the burning throne that the people could not ignore it. Where the king ruled with fire that consumed, Enoch walked with light that healed. Where fear spread through valleys, he brought calmness that settled like dew. He did not overthrow the throne, nor did he raise his hand in rebellion. Instead, his very being stood as a quiet rebuke to cruelty. His walk reminded the people that another way existed, a way unchained from violence and pride, a way of walking not in terror but in communion. Children began to follow him sometimes, their little steps hurrying to keep pace. He would not turn them away but would slow, letting them walk beside him. To them he spoke of creation's beauty, of rivers meant to sing, of trees designed to give shade and fruit, of stars hung not for fear, but for wonder. His words painted the world as it had been before cruelty twisted it, and the children, wide-eyed, carried these images into their dreams. In their innocence, they clung to his light, as though they understood instinctively what their elders struggled to grasp. That Enoch was not merely walking upon the earth, but walking with the very one who shaped it. The weak who whispered at night found their prayers changing in his presence. Where once they pleaded in fear, their voices began to carry tones of trust. Their words did not grow louder, but they grew steadier, as though drawn upward by the same unseen hand that guided Enoch's steps. He seemed to lend them courage not by command, but simply by example, showing them that weakness, when surrendered, could rise into strength through the presence of the eternal. There were nights when his visions became so vivid that those near him felt swept into them. He would speak of thrones, not of fire, but of brilliance, thrones surrounded by rivers of living light. He described beings clothed in glory. So, sung by countless voices, the sound of which no cruelty could drown. His words drew the people into that vision, if only for moments, lifting them out of their despair. They would leave those gatherings with hearts heavy, yet strangely comforted, as though they had tasted the fragrance of a place not yet seen. Enoch walked on through valleys, across fields, and along riversides, and wherever he went, his light lingered even after he had gone. The earth seemed to remember his steps, and the people whispered of him not as a ruler, not as a warrior, but as a friend of the Most High. His very life became a living testimony, a reminder that even in the shadow of cruelty, it was possible to walk in harmony with heaven. And so the weak prayed on, the throne burned on, but between them walked Enoch, carrying visions like dreams, warnings like songs, and light like dawn breaking upon the night. His steps never faltered, his voice never wavered, and in his gentle presence the people caught glimpses of what it meant to walk not in the fear of men, but in the companionship of God. The nights grew heavier, filled with strange murmurings that seemed to ride upon the wind. Men who once slept without trouble began to stir in unease, their slumber shattered by visions too vivid to dismiss. They awoke with sweat on their brows, whispering of waters that rose higher than mountains, of skies split apart as though torn by unseen hands. These dreams came not only to the weak but also to the mighty. Even the giants, those who had mocked heaven and spread terror across the valleys, found themselves shaken. In the stillness of night, their booming laughter fell silent, replaced by restless shifting, as they too were visited by visions they could not control. The dreams were not ordinary, for they lingered long after morning light returned. Farmers dreamed of fields drowning, their crops sinking beneath waves that never receded. Hunters dreamed of forests vanishing under waters that stretched as far as the eye could see. Children clung to their parents, speaking of rivers swelling until the stars themselves seemed reflected in their endless surface. The giants, though, had the most troubling dreams. Their strength could not shield them from the images pressed upon their minds. Towers collapsing like brittle clay, their own enormous bodies tossed aside by currents greater than their might. The earth itself trembling as though gasping for air. Some tried to dismiss the dreams as tricks of the night, but they returned again and again. Faces that had once shown only pride now carried shadows of doubt. The laughter of kings grew strained, and even the music in their courts faltered, for musicians too found their nights haunted by waves crashing against the heavens. Sleep, which once offered relief from the toil of day, became a place of dread, for none could escape the tide that swept through their visions. The dreams wove themselves together as though carried by one hand, telling a story that none wished to hear. Skies broke open, releasing torrents that blurred the line between heaven and earth. Waters rose with relentless power, not pausing for cities, not sparing the strong or the weak. Voices in the dreams cried out, some in terror, some in regret, but the waters drowned them all until only silence remained. Men and giants alike woke with hearts racing, their strength drained not by battle, but by the weight of what they had seen. In villages and marketplaces, whispers spread. Neighbors asked one another if they too had dreamed of rising waters, and almost always the answer was yes. Fear threaded through their words, yet Mao Yang So. One dared to speak it loudly. To confess fear was to confess weakness, and in a world where giants walked among them, weakness was dangerous. Still, the unease grew, gathering like clouds before a storm. People moved with slower steps, their laughter subdued, their prayers more urgent though their voices trembled. The giants, though unwilling to admit fear, could not hide their restlessness. They woke in anger, striking the ground or roaring into the night sky as if challenging the visions to return. Yet when sleep came again, the dreams returned with sharper clarity. Some of the giants described seas swallowing their fortresses, waves that reached even to their towering shoulders, dragging them downward into depths where no light remained. They tried to dismiss these images as weakness of mind, but when the same dream appeared night after night, even their defiance grew hollow. Among men, elders gathered in hushed circles to discuss what the visions might mean. Some claimed it was judgment, that the earth itself had grown weary of bloodshed and pride. Others feared it was a curse, a punishment too vast for them to escape. Yet even those who denied such thoughts could not silence the unease in their hearts. For how could so many share the same dream unless it was sent from beyond themselves? The nights grew colder, though the seasons had not changed. Fires burned brightly in every dwelling, yet the chill seemed to creep into the bones of those who dreamed. Mothers held their children close, soothing them with gentle words, though their own eyes carried the same fear. Fathers stood at doorways, staring at the darkened horizon, as though expecting to see waves already forming in the distance. And still, each night, the dreams returned, growing more detailed, more insistent, as if they sought not only to warn, but to prepare. In the courts of rulers, silence fell heavier than ever before. Counselors spoke cautiously, unwilling to admit their own troubled sleep. The king's musicians played softer, their songs unable to chase away the dread that clung to the chamber. Even the burning throne seemed to flicker uneasily, its flames casting shadows that moved like waves upon the walls. Though none dared say it aloud, even the throne seemed powerless against the visions that poured into the minds of all who slept. One giant, greater in size than most, raged against the dreams. He shattered stones with his fists, declaring that no wave could move him, that no sky could break above his head. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried a tremor, and his eyes shifted restlessly, betraying the fear he would not confess. Another giant sought to drown the dreams in revelry, filling his nights with endless feasts and noise. But when silence finally came, and his eyes closed, the waves returned, higher and stronger than before. The people began to notice signs in the world around them. Rivers swelled with unseasonable rains. Clouds gathered with a heaviness that seemed unnatural, their movements slower, more deliberate. Animals grew restless, fleeing valleys for higher ground without clear reason. Even the air felt heavier, charged as if waiting for something unseen. These signs deepened the dread, for they seemed to confirm the truth of the dreams. Yet the dreams themselves carried a strange calmness amid their terror. The waters, though relentless, moved with purpose, as though guided by a hand beyond anger. The skies broke not in rage, but in solemnity, as though unveiling what had long been hidden. Even in their dread, dreamers awoke with a sense that what they had seen was not chaos, but inevitability. The flood was not a storm born of chance, but something woven into the order of things, a cleansing that held not be turned aside. And so the days moved on, burdened by nights that no longer brought rest. Men and giants alike walked beneath the same sky, carrying the weight of visions they could not escape. Each carried the knowledge, whether admitted or denied, that the world as they knew it trembled on the edge of change. The laughter of the cruel grew quieter, the prayers of the weak grew stronger, and in the hearts of all, a question lingered: how long before the dreams spilled into waking life? The nights that once echoed with the thunder of the Nephilim's laughter grew quieter, as though even their enormous voices were weary of defiance. Their towering forms moved more slowly, their heavy steps pressing deeper into the earth as if the weight upon their shoulders had grown unbearable. They were beings who once mocked the heavens, who reveled in power and crushed nations beneath their might. Yet now, in the stillness of shadowed nights, sorrow began to creep into their hearts. It was not a sorrow they would speak openly, for pride still bound their tongues, but it showed in their silences, in the way they gazed at the horizon as if waiting for something they could neither fight nor flee. Their dreams had left them restless, and though they resisted with all their strength, they could not banish the visions that haunted them. The same waves that had swallowed their laughter in the night returned again and again, pulling them into depths where no light could reach. They woke in anger, but beneath that anger was fear, and beneath the fear was despair. They sensed, though they would not admit, that the tides of destiny were turning against them. They had been born of greatness and ruin, children of the mingling of heaven's fire with earth's clay. Yet even that origin could not shield them from the judgment that crept closer with every day. Some of the giants roared their defiance into the sky, shaking the ground beneath them. Their cries were both challenge and plea, though they themselves could not distinguish the difference. They cursed the visions, cursed the heavens, cursed the frailty of men who whispered prayers in the night. Yet their words rang hollow, for they knew within themselves that strength alone could not shatter the truth they felt pressing upon their spirits. No stone could be hurled high enough to break the sky, no fortress tall enough to stand above the flood they had seen. Their despair was like a shadow, clinging no matter how fiercely they tried to cast it aside. Others grew quiet, sinking into solitude. They wandered alone in valleys where once they had boasted, staring at rivers that ran steadily to the sea. Some bent down to touch the waters, tracing their flow with hands that had once crushed armies. The rivers whispered to them in ways they did not understand, carrying the promise of a greater current yet to come. They felt small before it, though they were giants, and that feeling was perhaps the sharpest wound of all. For creatures born to dominate, to bow before nothing, the realization of helplessness was a grief too deep to name. Their sorrow showed itself in strange ways. Some sang low songs, deep voices rumbling like distant storms. The words were few, often little more than murmured fragments, yet they carried the weight of mourning, as if the giants already stood among ruins. Others carved their laments into stone, etching vast walls with images of waves rising, towers falling, stars dimming. The carvings were not made to last. They were desperate acts, as if the giants wished to leave behind something of themselves before the waters erased their memory. Still others sought to drown their despair in revelry, calling for endless feasts and roaring laughter. But even in their drunken boasts, silence would fall suddenly, heavy and uncomfortable, as though sorrow had sat down among them uninvited. The younger giants, who had never known a world without their dominance, looked to the elders for reassurance. But the elders' eyes betrayed the truth. They could not hide the heaviness within them, the knowledge that their line would not endure. They told stories of battles won, of cities burned, of power that once seemed eternal. Yet the words faltered, for they knew no story could undo what was coming. The despair lay not only in the loss of life, but in the loss of meaning. They had been carved out as rulers, as symbols of might, and now they were being reduced to frightened shadows of themselves. The men who lived in fear of them began to notice the change. They saw the giants move more slowly, their roars less often heard, their feasts more muted. Some whispered that even the Nephilim had begun to sense judgment, that even the mighty could not escape what was ordained. These whispers passed quietly from house to house, strengthening the prayers of the weak. For if even the giants trembled, then the visions of flood and ruin must surely be true. Yet for all their despair, the Nephilim resisted. Their pride would not let them kneel. They sharpened weapons of stone and iron, as though blades might cut through waters or shields might hold back the sky. They built fortresses taller than before, piling stone upon stone until their towers reached into the clouds. Some claimed they would stand above any flood, that they would defy both earth and heaven. But even as they labored, the shadow of their despair clung to them. The higher their walls rose, the heavier their hearts became, as though they themselves knew that no wall could guard against the tide of fate. There were moments when sorrow slipped past their pride in gentle ways. A giant mother, holding her child in her vast arms, looked at the smallness of his sleeping form and felt tears rise unbidden. She whispered to him in words too soft for others to hear, not words of victory or conquest, but of longing, for safety, for tomorrow, for a world where the ground did not tremble beneath the promise of judgment. Another giant sat upon a mountain ledge, watching the sun sink into the horizon. He spoke no words, but his eyes followed the light as though fearing it might never return. Their despair became like a song spread across the land, low and mournful. It carried in their steps, in the silence between their roars, in the weight of their laughter that no longer reached their eyes. They resisted with weapons, with walls, with boasts shouted into the night. Yet the sorrow remained, soft but unyielding, a quiet truth beneath all their noise. They were mighty, yet they were fading. They were proud, yet they were breaking. And though they would never confess it aloud, the Nephilim knew that the shadow over them was not only of waters to come, but of their own ending. Their despair was not the despair of the weak who plead for mercy and hope for deliverance. It was the despair of the mighty who sense the fall yet will not bend. It was heavy, poetic, quiet, a sorrow that echoed through the valleys and clung to the mountains, leaving behind a silence deeper than any roar could fill. Even in their resistance, their hearts carried the whisper that all things, even giants, must pass when the will of heaven moves against them. The silence of the heavens trembled when judgment fell upon the watchers. These angels, who had once descended with brilliance and song, now found themselves seized by a power greater than their rebellion. Their wings, which once shimmered with radiant light, darkened as they were dragged from the heights they had abandoned. No longer did they stride the mountains or whisper forbidden secrets to humankind. They were gathered like prisoners of war, their cries rising in defiance before fading into the thunder of justice. They had sought to escape the order of the heavens, but now the weight of eternity pressed against them, binding them to a fate they could not resist. The earth itself seemed to recoil as their sentence was pronounced. Valleys shuddered, mountains cracked, and the very skies grew heavy with storm. Chains not forged by mortal hands clamped around their limbs, glowing with fire that burned but did not consume. These were bonds of divine decree, unbreakable, as though the very laws of creation had woven themselves into metal and flame. The Watchers, who had once looked down with disdain upon humankind, now found themselves staring into an abyss where no star shone, their glory stripped, their voices turned into echoes of anguish. Some resisted until the end, roaring like storms across the heavens. Their voices rolled like thunder, shaking forests and seas. But the power that descended upon them was not like the power they once wielded. It was deeper, older, and infinite. No cry, no struggle, no flare of defiance could loosen the chains that wrapped around them. Their wings were folded against their backs, pressed by unseen hands until their radiance dimmed to embers. They fell, not like meteors streaking with glory, but like broken stars swallowed by night. The earth groaned beneath the weight of their fall, yet it was the abyss that opened its mouth to receive them. The abyss was not a place of silence. It was alive with fire, shadows, and unending echoes. The chains burned with a brilliance that mirrored the heavens they had betrayed, yet here the fire was no comfort. It scorched without light, consuming pride, stripping power, and binding spirit. Their cries rose like waves, each one crashing against the unseen walls of that pit, only to fall back into themselves. They cried for freedom, they cried for vengeance, they cried in madness, but all their cries dissolved into a thunder that rolled endlessly, far away from mortal ears. And yet, sometimes, in the stillness of the night, men swore they heard those distant cries, like thunder on a horizon where no storm gathered, like a trembling deep beneath the mountains. The voices of the Watchers lingered faintly in the fabric of creation. Farmers in their fields looked up, startled at a sudden rumble, though the sky above was clear. Shepherds in the wilderness felt the earth tremble softly, though no beast stirred. It was said that the sorrow of the bound angels could not be entirely hidden, that even chained in flame and darkness, their mourning pressed faintly into the world they had once corrupted. Their despair was not merely for themselves, but for what they had lost. They remembered the heights, the singing of the stars, the harmony of their brethren. They remembered the gaze of the Almighty, a gaze they had turned away from. Now, in their abyss, they saw nothing but shadow and fire. Time itself became their torment, for every moment stretched like an age, and every age like eternity. To creatures born for the endless beauty of heaven, the endless prison of the pit was a wound beyond healing. The fire licked around them, curling like serpents of judgment. It did not consume their essence, for that would have been release. Instead, it bound them in an agony without end. They would not flee, they could not hide, and they could not die. Their power, once feared and adored, had been stripped bare, reduced to memory and lament. They had traded eternity for moments of rebellion, traded harmony for corruption, traded glory for dust. Now they bore the weight of that choice, not in silence, but in cries that rolled like thunder across the deep. Some still sought to whisper in their chains, their voices carrying up through cracks in the abyss. Their whispers were faint, broken, yet dangerous. Men who listened too closely to the ground, to the wind in lonely deserts, sometimes claimed to hear secrets not meant for mortal ears. The bound Watchers, desperate to reach upward, sometimes loosed fragments of forbidden knowledge, though twisted now by pain. But their reach was weak. their words scattered like ash on the wind. The pit was their tomb, and every cry that escaped was only a shadow of the voices they once commanded. The other angels, those who had not fallen, looked upon their bound brethren with sorrow, but not with pity, for they understood that justice must be fulfilled, and that the rebellion of the Watchers had brought corruption into the world. Still, even the loyal hosts grieved to hear the distant thunder of their cries, for they remembered what had been lost. Their brothers, who had once shone with the same light, now dimmed and chained in flame. Yet none dared question the decree, for they knew that the weight of rebellion could never go unanswered. The abyss itself became like a wound in creation, a place where fire and darkness mingled in endless turmoil. The cries of the Watchers gave it voice, the clashing of their chains gave it rhythm. It was a prison deeper than the seas, older than the mountains, and darker than any night. No man could descend there, no beast could approach. It was a place sealed by divine command, inaccessible too. All save the judge who had placed them there. And so it remained, a chasm of sorrow where the Watchers writhed, their thunderous laments rising into eternity. Their pride still lingered in fragments. Even in chains, some lifted their heads, eyes burning with fire not their own. They would not beg, they would not repent, but even their pride had become hollow, for it could not undo their fall. The abyss swallowed their defiance as easily as their cries, leaving them with nothing but themselves, chained to their choices, bound to their ruin. The fire reflected endlessly in their eyes, a mirror of what they had become. And yet, beyond their cries, beyond their anguish, beyond the thunder of their despair, there was silence above. The heavens did not answer, the earth did not intervene. Their voices rolled and broke, again and again, against the vast silence of eternity. It was that silence, more than chains or fire, that hollowed them. For it was a reminder that they had been cast out, that they were forgotten by the light they once knew. Their cries would echo forever, like distant thunder that never brings rain, a sound of sorrow and fury swallowed by the abyss. The great hall blazed with firelight, its stone walls trembling with the echoes of music and laughter. Torches lined the pillars like spears of flame, their smoke drifting upward in slow spirals, staining the ceiling with shadow. At the center sat the king, his face flushed with wine, his eyes gleaming with the madness of arrogance. He lifted a golden cup high, mocking the silence that seemed to press against the edges of the celebration. His voice, loud and unyielding, drowned the murmurs of fear that had begun to grow among his people. For though whispers of doom had carried through the city, he chose to answer them not with humility, but with revelry. Tables groaned beneath the weight of food, meats roasted until their skin cracked and juices ran down onto golden platters. Bowls overflowed with fruits, bread rose in great baskets, and wine spilled over the lips. Of pitchers like rivers of crimson, the air itself was thick with the scent of feasting, smoke, spice, and blood mingling until it clung to every breath. Minstrels plucked at strings, their music sharp and urgent, as though they were forced to drown out something darker pressing in from the silence beyond. The king leaned back on his throne, which was carved with images of lions and fire, a seat meant to mirror his own might. The flames of the torches flickered against his crown, painting him in a glow that seemed almost otherworldly, though it was only arrogance made visible. He laughed with every warning, mocking the seers who had dared to speak of judgment. "Let the heavens burn," he shouted, raising his cup again, "for tonight the earth belongs to me." His voice rolled through the hall, and the crowd cheered, though the cheer was brittle, breaking apart like glass. Guests bowed low, not from loyalty, but from fear. They had heard the voices of prophets crying in the streets, had seen the signs etched in the sky and the trembling of the ground beneath their feet. Yet none dared speak. The king's wrath was sharper than any truth, and so they smiled, ate, and raised their cups in hollow unity. Their laughter was thin, their songs cracked, but the king heard only obedience. His pride filled the hall like smoke, choking the air, leaving no room for doubt or humility. Behind him, shadows flickered across the walls. The firelight twisted into shapes that seemed almost alive, dancing with mockery, whispering in silence. The king, blinded by his own glory, did not see how the shadows seemed to grow thicker with every boast, how the flames bent lower, as if weighed by unseen hands. He saw only his feast, his court, his power. The firelight gilded him in false majesty, while the darkness gathered like a storm at the edges of the hall. The music grew louder, desperate. The rhythm quickened as though trying to hold back the inevitable. Drums pounded like racing hearts, flutes cried like wailing voices, and yet it was not enough to erase the weight in the air. Servants moved quickly, carrying fresh plates, pouring more wine, their eyes wide with unease. They glanced toward the windows where the night pressed in heavy and silent, but quickly lowered their gaze. To be caught looking outward was to invite punishment, for the king demanded that all eyes remain fixed upon him. He called for toasts, one after another, each more blasphemous than the last. He mocked the heavens, mocked the warnings, mocked even the gods of neighboring nations. "If fire comes," he sneered, "then let it find me drunk and laughing." He pounded the table, sending golden plates clattering, wine spilling like blood across the floor. His laughter rang like iron against stone, hard and cold, and the courtiers forced themselves to echo it, though their faces were pale. As the night deepened, the feast grew more frenzied. The king demanded dancers, and they came, moving in the firelight like phantoms, their bodies casting long shadows across the walls. He demanded more wine, and the pitchers were emptied until the floor ran sticky with spilled drink. He demanded song, and the minstrels played until their fingers bled. All the while the fire burned lower, the shadows stretched higher, and the weight of unseen eyes pressed upon the hall. The king ignored it. His arrogance was a shield against the silence that sought to creep into his heart. He filled the emptiness with noise, with fire, with pride. He looked upon his guests, upon the great piles of food, the jewels, the gold, the banners that hung heavy with embroidered glory, and he believed himself eternal. No judgment, no warning, no whisper of doom could reach him here. He raised his cup once more, his voice booming, declaring himself greater than fear, greater than prophecy, greater even than the heavens themselves. Yet as he drank, the flames flickered low, sputtering as though a breath unseen had passed through the hall. Shadows pooled at the edges, swallowing the carvings of lions and fire upon his throne. The torches hissed, their smoke curling like black fingers toward the ceiling. Still the king laughed, though the sound now carried unease, as though he too felt the weight pressing in, though he refused to name it. The guests sat stiff, their hands trembling as they raised their cups. They knew, though none would speak. They saw how the fire no longer warmed but glared, how the shadows no longer danced but waited. The air had grown thick, every breath heavy with the taste of smoke and iron. Even the music faltered, the strings snapping one by one, leaving only the pounding of drums like the heartbeat of doom. Still, the king mocked. His voice rose above the silence, above the trembling, above the warnings that had been spoken in the streets. "Look upon my glory," he shouted, spreading his arms wide, wine dripping from his fingers, "and know that no power can unseat me." His words echoed through the hall, but the echo was not his own. It returned hollow, heavy, as though the walls themselves rejected his boast. The feast continued, but it was no longer celebration. It had become a ritual of defiance, a final act against the inevitable. Firelight clung stubbornly to the hall, though it was being swallowed by shadow. The king drank until his crown slipped sideways on his brow, until his laughter broke into a roar that shook the tables. He stood upon his throne, cup raised high, mocking the silence one last time, daring the heavens to strike. His voice filled the hall, his arrogance burned brighter than the fire, and his shadow stretched long across the stone floor, reaching like a dark river toward the doors where judgment waited unseen. The mountains stood silent at first, ancient and unmoving, their peaks rising like watchmen against the horizon. For centuries they had carried the weight of seasons, bearing snow, rain, and sun with quiet endurance. But now, something stirred in the air around them, a heaviness that was not of ordinary weather. The sky darkened in slow degrees, a curtain being drawn across the heavens, layer by layer, until light itself seemed reluctant to remain. The wind, once soft and scattered, grew steady and deep, sighing through the valleys like a voice preparing to speak. Clouds gathered in slow procession, first thin and pale, then darker, thicker, as though woven by unseen hands. They did not drift aimlessly, but moved with intent, a tide of shadows swelling higher with every moment. The blue of the heavens dimmed until it was swallowed in shades of gray and black, colors layered so densely that the peaks themselves began to fade, their sharp outlines softening beneath the advancing shroud. Yet the mountains did not resist. They stood still, silent, waiting as though they, too, understood that something greater than mere weather was rising. A hush fell over the land. Birds that had filled the air with their songs hours earlier had gone silent, their nests tucked deep into the branches of trees, swaying in uneasy rhythm. Animals slipped into hidden places, the rustle of their movement swallowed quickly by the stillness that spread through the valleys. Even rivers seemed subdued, their once quick waters now heavy with reflection, carrying the darkening sky upon their backs. It was as though all of creation paused, watching the slow gathering of the storm. Lightning flickered far away, so faint at first it might have been mistaken for a trick of the eye. A thin vein of white split the horizon, then vanished into the folds of the clouds. Another followed, brighter, jagged, tracing too, the underbelly of the storm like a warning. No thunder came at first, only the silence of anticipation. The light marked the sky in brief and fleeting strokes, illuminating the depth of the clouds, showing their vast and swelling forms as they climbed upon one another like waves of a black sea. The wind shifted, colder now, carrying the scent of rain not yet fallen, of stone, and of the deep earth itself. It moved through the mountain passes with low and steady force, brushing against cliffs and slopes, whistling through jagged ridges as if the peaks themselves were flutes in the hands of the unseen. Trees bowed beneath it, their branches trembling as if in reverence, leaves torn loose to dance briefly in the air before being swallowed by the gathering shadows. When the first rumble of thunder came, it was distant, muted, like the clearing of a throat beyond the horizon. It rolled slowly, not loud but deep, resonating in the chest, reminding the living that the sky itself could speak. Then came another, closer, heavier, reverberating through the valleys, shaking loose stones from the cliff sides. The sound lingered, echoing from peak to peak, refusing to fade quickly, as though the mountains were answering in their own solemn voices. The clouds pressed lower, their bellies swollen and restless. They wrapped themselves around the summits until the peaks disappeared, swallowed by the storm. The highest places where snow had long rested vanished into shadow, and the ridges seemed to melt into the rolling sky. Light dimmed further until the land was cast into twilight, though the day had not yet ended. Darkness stretched its fingers across the slopes, down into the valleys, until the division between mountain and sky became uncertain. Lightning struck again, this time nearer, sharp and blinding. It tore across the clouds like a blade of fire, searing through the blackness and carving a path of brilliance that lingered in the eyes long after it was gone. Thunder followed instantly, loud and consuming, shaking the very bones of the earth. It was no longer the distant voice of warning, but the roar of presence, a declaration that the storm had fully arrived. Rain began to fall, not in torrents at first, but in heavy drops that smacked against stone and soil. They landed with deliberate weight, each one a prelude to the flood that waited above. The air thickened with moisture, cool against the skin, heavy with the promise of release. The rhythm of the drops echoed across the mountainsides, steady and growing, like a drumbeat counting down the final moments of calm. Soon, the drops multiplied, becoming sheets, a curtain of water descending from the heavens. valleys filled with the sound of rushing water, rivers swelling as if awakened from slumber. The mountains bore the storm with their ancient stillness. They did not bend, they did not flee. They had seen ages come and go, had carried the weight of countless skies, and now they stood as witnesses to judgment's approach. Lightning carved their ridges into stark relief, thunder rolled across their flanks, rain washed their slopes clean, and still they endured in silence. It was not their place to resist, but to testify, to stand unmoving as the heavens poured forth their power. The storm grew louder, fiercer. Winds howled down the passes, tearing at trees, bending them until they groaned. Rock faces shuddered beneath the weight of constant rain, rivulets carving fresh scars into the earth. Shadows and flashes chased one another endlessly across the ridges, every moment lit and extinguished in the same breath. The world seemed caught between fire and water, lasan, lightning and flood, light and darkness, suspended in the tension of a sky that refused to relent. Yet even within the fury, there was a strange stillness. The storm was vast, overwhelming, yet not chaotic. Each lightning strike, each rumble of thunder, each torrent of rain felt deliberate, as though placed with intention. It was not destruction for the sake of violence, but order expressed through power, the calm voice of nature speaking in thunderous tones. The mountains received it with dignity, their silence unbroken, their foundations firm. They seemed to understand that this storm was not merely weather, but the arrival of something greater, a tide moving through the world that no creature could resist. And so the storm continued, gathering, deepening, filling the land with sound and silence, light and shadow. The skies, once calm and open, had become a vast sea of roiling black, and the mountains, steadfast and ancient, stood beneath it like islands waiting for the flood to rise. All creation held its breath, caught in the rhythm of lightning and rain, watching as the storm prepared its final act, knowing the judgment it carried would not pass in silence. The rain did not announce itself with fury at first. It came as a steady rhythm, gentle in its opening notes, as though the sky wished to soothe the earth before unveiling the weight of what it carried. The droplets fell with a lullaby's cadence, tapping against stone and soil, sliding down leaves in shimmering trails. Each drop landed as if part of a quiet song, filling valleys with a sound that seemed almost tender. For a moment, it did not feel like judgment. It felt like a cradle song from the heavens, soft and unhurried, a murmur upon the skin of the world. The first hours passed in calmness, families huddled inside their homes, listening to the patter of water against rooftops, the trickle-down wooden beams, the whispering splash upon the earth. Fields drank deeply at first, soil darkening as it received the gift of rain. Streams filled and sparkled, carrying ripples like strands of silver through meadows. The air, heavy with the perfume of wet earth, seemed almost comforting, as if nature itself sought to quiet the fears of the restless. Yet the sky did not rest, nor did the drops cease. Gradually the song of rain deepened. The rhythm grew steadier, stronger, until the sound ceased to be delicate and became consuming. The lullaby transformed into a choir, thousands of voices falling in unison, unbroken and endless. What once was gentle began to weigh heavy. Soil that had drunk eagerly at first now sagged beneath the burden, water rising above the roots, streams swelling over their banks, paths softening into mud. The sound filled every hollow, echoing across the valleys, until there was no silence left between the notes of the rain. The rivers, once playful and narrow, grew restless. They spilled from their beds, stretching their arms across the lowlands. Grasslands disappeared beneath their reach, and stones long hidden beneath the earth were uncovered and carried away. The water, which had seemed a gift, now moved with persistence, seeping into cracks, pressing against doors, climbing the sides of homes where children once played. Its voice was still steady, still soft compared to the roaring storms yet to come, but there was no mistaking its intent. It was not leaving. From the mountains, streams fell in white ribbons, weaving through the slopes with new strength. Water pooled in hollows, filled hidden caves, and tumbled into the valleys below. Every ridge and every cliffside became a channel, guiding the sky's gift downward until it gathered in the lowlands. Villages found themselves surrounded not by fields, but by slow-moving lakes that reflected the dim light of the storm above. The surface rippled endlessly, disturbed by the ceaseless tapping of drops, so that even reflection itself seemed unsettled. People stepped outside and lifted their hands to the sky, some in awe, some in defiance, some in quiet resignation. Their voices rose in shouts that were swallowed quickly by the rain. Those who still feasted or mocked could not drown out the sound, for the rain was louder now than song, louder than laughter, louder even than anger. The waters crept forward without malice, without pause, their silence more dreadful than any thunderclap. Animals sought the high places, their instinct leading them before human eyes understood the truth. Flocks pressed upward into the slopes, hooves sinking into softened earth, wings lifting birds higher into the gray clouds. The forests grew restless, filled with movement, the underbrush alive with creatures seeking safety. Their calls echoed briefly before vanishing into the endless whisper of rain. Even the smallest of them, mice, insects, hidden things, were lifted upon leaves and bark, carried by streams that had never before existed. Nights and days blurred together beneath the veil of falling water. Sun and moon alike were hidden, their light smothered by the heavy shroud of clouds. Time no longer marked itself with rising and setting, but with the deepening of floods. The steady climb of water upon stone, the slow disappearance of landmarks once familiar. Hillsides became islands, roads became rivers. Silence grew not from the absence of sound, but from its overwhelming presence. The endless, steady voice of rain that allowed no pause, no breath of quiet. Inside homes, families watched as water climbed their walls. At first it seeped through the cracks in the floorboards, pooling in corners. Then it reached the knees, then the waist, then the chest, forcing them upward to rooftops. The steady patter above them became a drumbeat, urging them higher, driving them into the open air. Those who reached the roofs looked out upon a world they scarcely recognized. Where once fields and villages stretched, there was only water, endless and silver gray beneath the storm. The sea and sky seemed to merge, their boundaries lost. The horizon disappeared, erased by sheets of falling rain and the swelling of waters that rose without cease. The earth seemed to sink into silence, buried beneath the tide. Voices cried out, but they were scattered, muffled, lost in the unrelenting choir of the storm. No trumpet sounded, no final call marked the change. Only the steady rain, falling as it had from the first drop, sang its endless lullaby. The waters moved without haste, yet with certainty. They swirled around the roots of trees until even the tallest began to tremble, their branches thrashing in the wind before giving way, surrendering to the flood. Houses shuddered, timbers groaning as they loosened and broke, carried away piece by piece. Whole villages dissolved into the tide, their names erased in silence, their histories carried into the deep. Still the rain fell with the same steady rhythm, unbroken, as if the heavens had decided upon a single note and would play it without end. As the waters deepened, the mountains themselves seemed smaller. Peaks that once soared above all else now stood as lonely islands, their slopes swallowed by the rising tide. Those who sought safety upon them watched as the waves crept higher still, climbing stone with patient determination. The mountains did not resist, they only bore the weight of the storm, their silence mirroring the silence of the heavens that gave no answer to cries below. The world softened beneath the flood. Edges blurred, shapes dissolved, roads, walls, boundaries, all were washed away until there was no longer distinction between village and field, between land and river, between earth and sea. All became one endless expanse of moving gray. The silence of creation was not empty, but full, filled with the soft thunder of rain, the whisper of waves brushing against what little remained above water. And so the waters rose, softly, steadily, like a song sung without end. What began as a gentle lullaby had become an endless ocean, a silence deeper than words, a stillness carried on waves that swallowed all but memory. The world rested beneath it, hushed by the voice of the flood, as though cradled once more in the arms of the heavens, waiting for what would come when the song was finally complete. Upon the waters there was one vessel that moved differently than all else. While homes, trees, and stones were swept away in fragments, this structure remained whole, steady upon the restless tides. It was heavy with the weight of its wood, yet it floated as though upheld by an unseen hand. Its form was simple, without ornament, yet there was a quiet dignity in its endurance. The rains poured without pause, the waters rose without mercy, and still it carried its passengers safely above the flood. From afar, it seemed a solitary witness to a world that had become a sea without end. Within its walls were voices that did not tremble. There were murmurs of prayer, the rustling of straw, the sound of animals shifting in their places. The air carried the warmth of life, breath of oxen, wool of sheep, wings of doves resting in quiet. Children whispered, their voices uncertain yet calmed by the presence of their parents. Noah moved among them, steady as the ark itself, his steps measured though the vessel swayed. His faith had built this sanctuary, plank upon plank, sealed with tar, guided not by the wisdom of men, but by the voice he had trusted when all others laughed. The rain outside still sang its endless song, but here inside there was another music, the rhythm of survival, the soft pulse of hope. The ark rose with the waters, lifted upon waves that grew higher with each passing hour. The storm did not break it, nor did the floods overcome it. It stood apart from the ruin, a quiet contrast, as if faith itself had been given shape in timber and pitch. From its windows, those inside could glimpse the world that had been left behind, but what they saw was not the land they once knew. Across the waters, shadows of mountains lingered, their peaks now islands. Upon their slopes clung the remnants of those who had mocked. The mighty ones, men of renown and strength, clung to cliffs as though their arms could hold back the sea. Giants who had towered over villages now seemed small against the rising waves. Their voices rose in cries that had once struck terror into the hearts of men. But now those roars dissolved into despair, drowned beneath the soft, steady fall of rain. Pride had been their crown, but it could not keep their heads above the tide. They reached upward, straining against the flood, muscles that had once torn stones apart now trembling as they grappled with the inevitable. The waters wrapped around their shoulders, their chests, their mouths. Some tried to swim, their limbs striking in defiance, but the ocean stretched without end, and even their strength could not find purchase in the abyss. For all their height, for all their might, the waves rose higher still. They sank, one after another, swallowed in silence, their pride scattered like dust beneath the waters. From the ark's distance, those inside could not hear the cries in detail, yet the shapes of struggle were visible through the mist. Noah's heart, though steady in obedience, did not harden. He had warned them, spoken words they had rejected, and now he watched as the truth unfolded with unrelenting clarity. He did not rejoice in their downfall. His eyes were heavy with sorrow, but his faith kept him from despair. The ark rocked gently, carrying the remnant of mankind while the great ones who had boasted of their strength sank into the deep. The flood covered all. Fields where children once played were gone. Villages where voices once sang were hushed, and even the towering fortresses of stone were lost beneath the tide. All that remained above the water was the ark, moving as though guided by an invisible path. Its wake left ripples that spread outward across the gray expanse, fading quickly into the endless sea. The world had become silent, save for the steady breathing within its walls and the unbroken sound of rain. Noah's family held one another close. Their eyes searched the horizon where nothing stood except the swelling waves. They could not see the land, nor the cities they had known, nor the faces of neighbors and friends. All was erased. Yet in that erasure was the quiet proof of the faith they had carried, a faith that had seemed foolish in the eyes of others. The ark was not merely wood, it was testimony. Every creak of its timbers, every sway upon the waters spoke of trust that had not been in vain. The animals rested with them, each species gathered in pairs. Their presence was a hum of life, a reminder that the story of creation had not ended with destruction. The lion, whose roar once shook the valleys, now lay silent in calm repose. The dove cooed softly, as if whispering comfort into the stillness. Even the restless creatures that once prowled the forests now lay subdued, lulled by the rocking of the ark and the muted thunder outside. It was as though all creation within the vessel recognized the hand that preserved them. The waters stretched on, unbroken. The ark floated above them like a leaf upon a vast ocean, carried by currents unseen. Its direction was not chosen by man, but it did not drift aimlessly. There was a purpose in its movement, though those inside could not yet see its end. Faith did not require the sight of land, it required trust in the one who guided the unseen. So the ark moved onward, steadfast amid the ruin, the only vessel of life upon a silent world. The giants were gone now, their pride, their boasts, their laughter all silenced beneath the flood. Their names that once carried weight now lay buried under waves that remembered nothing. From the ark, one might have thought the waters calm, for though the rain still fell, it no longer came with thunder or lightning. The storm had no need for spectacle. It accomplished its work in silence, lifting the ark higher while all else sank into forgetfulness. The contrast could not have been clearer. Pride sinking in weight, faith lifted in endurance. The waters did not choose. It was obedience that had drawn the line, obedience that had built the vessel, obedience that now floated while defiance drowned. The flood was not partial, sparing one and striking another at whim. It covered all. Yet within its grasp, faith found refuge. Noah and his family sat within the ark, not because they were strong, not because they were greater, but because they had listened, because they had trusted. And so the ark continued, distant against the horizon, its dark frame barely distinguishable from the storm that still veiled the heavens. It was small compared to the vastness around it, yet it was more enduring than all the monuments and towers that had once filled the world. A vessel of wood upon a sea of silence, it moved with steady grace, the last cradle of life in a world swept clean by the flood. He stood tall at first, as though the rising tide would bend to his command. Upon the mountainside where the waters licked higher and higher, the king roared as he had once roared in the courts of men, his voice echoing like thunder among the drowned valleys below. His hair clung to his shoulders, soaked, heavy with rain, yet his eyes still burned with that old fire of defiance. The storm raged around him, lightning striking like whips across the sky, and he raised his arms as though the heavens themselves would yield to his strength. But the heavens did not answer, and the sea continued to climb. This was the man whom tribes had bowed before, the one whose hand had struck fear into warriors, and whose shadow had darkened the doorways of villages. His height was greater than all around him, his body carved with strength like the roots of ancient trees. For years, no army had stood against him, no wall had kept him out. He had worn crowns of iron, feasted upon the spoils of conquest, and filled the night with the sound of his boasting. He believed himself unconquerable, as though the earth itself was too small to contain his dominion. But the waters that rose before him were no army. They were no flesh, no stone, no kingdom to seize. They were silence given form, and against silence even the mightiest voice grew small. At first he resisted with fury. His fists pounded against the current as if to crush it into submission. He climbed higher, leaping from one rock to another, each step pushing him above the flood, but each stone that held his weight soon vanished beneath the waves. His feet slipped, his legs pressed on, muscles straining, veins swelling. he clung to the face of the mountain, hauling himself upward with the same power that had once hurled spears across battlefields. Rain blinded him, salt stung his lips, but he pressed on, convinced that his body could rise higher than the judgment that swallowed all else. Behind him, his warriors were gone. Those who had followed his banners, who once trembled with loyalty at his command, had been swept away. Their cries had vanished into the roar of the flood, their weapons scattered into the deep. The king did not look back for them. He believed his strength was more than theirs combined, that even without them he would endure. His pride had always been a throne higher than stone, and he clung to it now as the sea swallowed his throne of earth. He climbed until his chest heaved and his limbs ached with the weight of his own body. His roar was broken now, not the cry of command, but the gasp of breathless struggle. Still he fought, still he would not bow. The waves foamed below him, a shifting mass that drew closer and closer. Lightning lit the peaks, and he stood against that light, a towering shadow etched for an instant against the storm. He believed in that moment that he was eternal, that no flood could erase him from the earth. Yet as quickly as the light had revealed him, the darkness returned, and he was once again only a man clinging to stone. At last, the water touched his feet. It rose to his ankles, his knees, his thighs. He braced himself, spreading his arms against the stone face of the mountain, holding himself aloft, as though his body could form a dam against the tide. But the current pressed harder, colder, heavier. He growled like a beast, thrusting his chest forward, forcing his lungs to draw air even as the spray filled his mouth. The waves slapped against him, beat against his body, dragged at his arms, and though he thrashed, though he strained every sinew, the water climbed without pause. His crown, once bound tightly, slipped from his head and tumbled into the depths. For the first time, he reached out for it, but his hand closed on nothing. The golden circle disappeared beneath the froth, and with it vanished the last symbol of his reign. He bellowed into the storm, a sound half despair and half fury, but even that sound was weaker now. His voice, which had shaken men, which had commanded armies, dissolved into the endless chorus of rain. His fire, the unyielding blaze of defiance that had carried him through countless battles, flickered within him, but the waters quenched it bit by bit. He tried to climb again, higher, always higher. His fingers clawed at stone that had become slick with rain, nails tearing, palms bleeding. The storm answered only with more rain, more wind, more water. His body trembled as the chill seeped deeper, his strength lessened, though he fought it with rage. The current swirled around him, dragging at his legs, dragging at his waist. He kicked, pressed upward, but the weight of the flood was stronger than even he. He remembered then, dimly, the days when he had laughed at the old man who built the vessel of wood. He remembered how his court had mocked the warnings, how his warriors had scorned the talk of judgment. He had believed himself above such things, beyond the reach of prophecy, untouchable by decrees not spoken in his own tongue. Now that memory came back like a wound reopened, bitter as the salt on his lips. But there was no time for Reggie. Rhett. The waters climbed past his chest, his throat, his chin. He gasped for breath, his arms thrashing, his head tilting back to catch the last space of air beneath the storm. His eyes widened as the flood reached them, stinging, blinding. He broke the surface once, his mouth wide, teeth clenched, as though to roar again. But no sound came, only the gurgle of water filling where breath had been. He plunged down, arms flailing, legs kicking against the pull. His fire sputtered as though a torch dropped into the deep. He rose once more, gasping, but the waves crashed upon him, silencing even that final cry. His crown was gone, his throne was gone, his people were gone, and now even his breath was gone. The silence closed around him. His arms grew heavy, his legs slack. The strength that had shaken earth and men alike failed him, as all strength fails before the endless deep. He sank slowly, his body surrendering at last. The storm raged above, but beneath the waters there was no storm, only stillness. His fire was out, extinguished by the flood, and in its place was only darkness. His body drifted downward, swallowed by the silence he could not conquer. Above, the rain fell without pause, unbroken, as though it had never been interrupted by his cry. The mountains lay half-buried, the valleys gone, and the waters stretched farther than sight could follow. No trace of his throne remained, no trace of his armies, no trace of his crown. The king who had believed himself eternal was gone, drowned in the judgment he had defied. The waves closed over him as though he had never been. There are whispers that if one could walk along the ocean floor, past the swaying forests of kelp and the groves of coral that have grown where land once stood, they would find shapes hidden in the blue silence. Towers rise, not of living reef, but of carved stone, their tops worn smooth by centuries of tides. Broken arches stand like the bones of giants, leaning, half-buried in sand. The currents slip through what were once streets, brushing away the dust of ages, carry grains of stone from walls that were cut by hands far too great for this age to imagine. It is said that this was the city of the Nephilim, a place where their laughter echoed against high ceilings, where their fires burned in courtyards too vast for mortal kings, and where the shadows of their bodies stretched across plazas as wide as valleys. Now those plazas are silent, layered with shells and fragments of coral. Fishes move where merchants once shouted, their scales glinting like living shards of glass as they dart through the hollow windows of ruined halls. The water distorts the shapes of columns, bending them as if they were swaying trees. But beneath the shifting light, one can see how massive they truly were. Each one was wider than a man is tall, carved with spirals and symbols that no scholar of this age can read. The symbols are softened now, worn by waves, but they still glow faintly when the moonlight reaches them, as though the stones remember a time when firelight once danced across their surface. The grand gate of the city lies toppled, one half buried in silt, the other leaning against a mound of stone. Barnacles cling to its face, oysters grow in its cracks, and sea anemones sway like tiny banners. Where once the gate opened to roads lined with watchtowers, now there is only a canyon of broken stone, filled with drifting schools of fish. And deeper within, where the heart of the city sleeps, stand the palaces of the giants, their walls blackened by the sea, their roofs collapsed, yet still holding the weight of their ancient presence. The windows yawn open, like eyes that never shut, staring into the vast blue wilderness of the sea. It is said that the giants built their city not with hands alone, but with the pride of their hearts, shaping stone to mirror their own power. Their staircases were too tall for men, their doorways so high that even echoes seemed to hesitate before entering. Now those staircases are layered with silt, their steps disguised by seaweed. The doorways open only to shadows where fish weave in and out, carrying silence deeper into the stone. The banquet halls where their voices thundered are quiet now, except for the crackle of shrimp hidden in corners and the low hum of water pressing against walls. Every table, every throne has been erased by the sea, yet the feeling of vastness lingers, as though the halls themselves still breathe faintly, remembering the weight of those who once sat within. The marketplace, where trade once filled the air with shouts, lies scattered in fragments. Stone stalls stand like hollow shells, their counters broken, their roofs collapsed. A chariot wheel rests in the sand, its spokes rotted away, leaving only a circular impression where barnacles nest. Pottery lies cracked and spread across the seabed, its painted patterns blurred into swirls by the constant wash of salt. Here and there, giant bones lie half-buried, long ribs and skulls with hollow eyes, shaped by currents until they resemble pale stone. They seem to watch the ruins around them as though guarding a secret no living soul was meant to hear. And deeper still, beyond the marketplace and the palaces, lies a temple. Its pillars, though broken, stand upright like solemn sentinels, and its altar lies covered in a blanket of coral that has grown as if to seal it forever. The sea moves gently through this place, as though even the waters know to lower their voice. Shadows linger here longer, and the silence is deeper. It is said that the Nephilim raised this temple not for men nor for Heave, but for something else entirely, something that the flood buried in silence so that no trace of it would rise again. Fish pass quickly through its doorways but never linger, and light bends strangely around the altar, as if unwilling to touch it fully. The city beneath the sea is not lifeless. It breathes in its own way. Gardens that once held trees and vines are now fields of coral, branching upward in crimson, violet, and gold. Where fountains once spilled water into carved basins, there now bloom starfish and clams. The sea has claimed what was built, but it has not left it empty. Instead, it has transformed it into a dreamlike place where everything is softened, slowed, hushed. The stones no longer echo with giant footsteps, but with the muffled rhythm of waves pressing down from above. And yet, though it is hushed, it does not feel forgotten. The ruins stir something in those who gaze upon them, as if the stones themselves still whisper. The patterns on the columns, blurred though they are, still seem to tell a story, though no one knows how to read it. The arches still curve toward the sky, though that sky is hidden beneath leagues of water. The palaces still hold their shape, though their walls are cracked. The silence of the place is not empty. It is heavy, as though layered with memories that refuse to fade. Divers who dream of such a city describe the way it seems to glow under the moon, the water above shimmering with silver light that filters down and brushes the ruins with a pale gleam. In those moments, it feels almost alive again, as if the giants could step once more through the gates and fill the halls with their voices. But when the sun rises and the sea brightens, the illusion vanishes, and the ruins remain, silent, broken, swallowed. There are those who say the ruins are not only stone. They say that when the waves are calm and the water is clear, you can see shadows moving where no fish swim, figures taller than any man, drifting through the streets as if still walking the paths they once knew. They move slowly, endlessly, without sound, as if bound to the city forever. Some believe these are only tricks of light, illusions caused by the shifting water. Others whisper they are the remnants of the Nephilim themselves, wandering their lost city, chained by judgment beneath the sea. Whether dream or shadow, the ruins remain. They lie beneath, unseen by most, unreachable except in stories and visions. They remind the world that there were once beings who believed they could build forever, who raised stones higher than mountains, who laughed at the heavens themselves. And now, all that is left of their pride is a hushed echo beneath the ocean, a city that lives only as an underwater dream. When the waters had finally calmed and the ground began to dry, the survivors found themselves in a world that felt both familiar and strange. Hills were reshaped, valleys filled with silt, rivers cut in new directions, and forests were gone where once they had stretched endlessly. Everything seemed quieter, subdued, as though the earth itself was exhausted from its trial. Among the few who remained, there was silence at first, the kind of silence that feels heavy, carrying the weight of memory too fresh to speak aloud. Yet silence never lasts forever, for people are made to remember, and memory, once it begins to take shape, becomes story. The stories that rose were not about fields or rivers, or even the long nights spent waiting for dry ground. They were about the giants. Fathers, with voices lowered in the glow of small fires, spoke of creatures taller than walls, stronger than stone, who once walked the ear, with steps that shook the ground. Mothers hushed their children with tales of their voices echoing like thunder across mountains. The children leaned close, wide-eyed, not yet able to tell the difference between terror and wonder, listening as if the very shadows might lean in to hear as well. These first stories were not yet myths, not yet softened by distance. They were memories, whispered with the tremble of those who had seen the pride and ruin of the Nephilim with their own eyes. In time, as days folded into weeks and weeks into years, those whispers began to change. The sharp edges of fear dulled, smoothed into something almost dreamlike. The giants became less like tyrants of flesh and bone and more like figures of the imagination, vast, hazy shapes that lived in the minds of children. They became warnings, woven into bedtime words. Parents would murmur, "Be humble, or you will rise too tall, like the giants who drowned in their pride." And so the giants, who had once ruled with arrogance, were transformed into shadows that watched from the edges of the mind, reminders of a world that should never return. Around the small hearths where survivors gathered, songs began to form. They were not grand songs meant for temples, but soft chants meant to soothe restless children. The rhythm of the words matched the crackle of firewood, the rise and fall of voices steady as the breathing of those drifting into sleep. They told of how the giants laughed at heaven, how they lifted stones higher than hills, and how the waters rose to swallow them whole. The voices of the singers trembled less as years went on, and the children who first heard them grew to pass them down themselves. The stories, softened by repetition, became less frightening and more like gentle cautions, as familiar as lullabies. And still, not all stories were the same. Some spoke of giants who were cruel, who crushed men beneath their steps and filled the air with shouts of war. Others whispered of giants who were sorrowful, who wandered the earth as though searching for something they had lost, their faces bent with grief. A few even told of giants who tried to resist their own fate, standing on mountaintops as the waters climbed higher, lifting their voices to the heavens in pleas that went unanswered. These versions were not told loudly, but they lingered, drifting like smoke, shaping the myths that would someday grow into legends. Children, curious by nature, asked endless questions. Were the giants taller than trees? Did they have voices like the wind? Could they see across the whole earth from where they stood? The parents, unable to say with certainty, let their imagination fill the spaces memory had left blank. They said the giants' eyes glowed like embers, that their hair fell like waterfalls, that their strength was so great they could tear mountains apart. Each telling grew a little grander, a little softer at the edges, until what had once been terrifying became something distant and dreamlike, like a shadow one remembers only from the corner of the eye. The younger children, never having seen the flood nor the giants, heard only the stories, and for them, that was all the giants ever were, stories. They carried them into their games, stomping across the dust like towering beings, pretending to speak in booming voices. Laughter spilled where once there had been terror, and in this way, memory transformed. What had been nightmare to their parents became play to them, and through play, the giants became fixed in the imagination, never entirely gone, never entirely real. With each passing season, the dust of the earth seemed to swallow the traces of the Nephilim. Stones shifted, bone sank, ruins were buried beneath layers of silt and sand. Yet in the minds of men, the giants did not vanish. They lingered in the words spoken softly at night, in the fireside tales meant to teach humility, in the cradle songs meant to quiet children to sleep. The world moved on, but the giants remained, not in flesh, but in memory, not in sight, but in song. Travelers carried these whispers farther, across valleys and hills, until villages that had never seen the flood still told stories of the mighty beings who once defied heaven. In one place, they were said to have been made of fire, in another, of clay hardened to stone. In some tales, they had wings that stretched across the horizon, while in others, they carried spears carved from mountains. Each people shaped the memory in their own way, letting the stories bend like reeds in the wind, always rooted in the truth of something vast, yet always softened into forms that fit the ears of children. As the generations turned, the whispers grew into legends. They were told not only to warn of pride, but to explain the strange scars of the earth, why certain valleys seemed unnaturally deep, why great stones stood upright in lonely fields, Why mountains bore marks as if clawed by enormous hands. People pointed to these places and said, "Here is where the giants walked. Here is where they fell. Here is where the earth still remembers." The dust itself seemed to hold the echo of their passing, and in that echo, the stories were given weight. Even as the memories, stretched thin, carried far beyond the time of those who had seen the flood, the stories never disappeared. They grew softer, yes, and more fantastical, but they remained. Around low fires, in the quiet of tents, in the shadows of new homes, parents still leaned close to their children and whispered of the Nephilim. The words were no longer heavy with fear, but gentle, almost melodic, as if carrying a rhythm that could cradle a child into dreams. The giants became part of the night itself, settling into the space between waking and sleeping, half real, half imagine. And so the world, reborn in dust and silence, did not truly lose the giants. Their cities may have fallen, their bones may have crumbled, their pride may have drowned beneath the waves, but their presence lived on in softer form. They became lullabies carried from mouth to ear, stories that settled gently into the hearts of children, legends that moved like wind across the dust, never gone, always remembered. After the waters had subsided and the new world stretched itself across the horizon, people believed that the giants had been washed away forever. Their ruins were gone beneath the sea, their bones buried beneath mud, their voices silenced. Yet there were whispers that not all had been lost. Among the children of men, stories lingered, softly spoken warnings that some of the old blood still pulsed quietly in veins that looked ordinary to the eye. The survivors did not say such things openly, for the thought was unsettling, but around fires, when the night pressed close and the air felt heavy, someone would lower their voice and murmur, "What if traces remain?" The idea alone was enough to stir unease. The Nephilim had been known not only for their strength and stature, but for the strangeness that set them apart from humankind. The glimmer in their gaze, the power in their voices, the shadow they carried into every place they walked. To think that some of that essence might still linger in their descendants was both terrifying and fascinating. People began to look more closely at those around them. A child who grew taller than the others was watched carefully. A man with eyes too bright or strength too sudden was remembered in whispers. Families carried unease in their bloodlines, and though no one could say for certain, the possibility was enough to haunt generations. The land itself seemed to echo the rumor. Strange places existed where the ground felt unnachu, ral, valleys too deep, caves too dark, stones that seemed to hum in silence. In those places, people said, the blood of giants had not fully died. They spoke of villages where children were born with voices that could not be ignored, where men wrestled with beasts and came away unmarked, where women dreamed visions that unfolded into reality. No one openly called it the mark of the Nephilim, but everyone thought it. They cloaked it in softer words, blessed, touched, unusual, but underneath the careful language lived the same quiet suspicion. Their blood is not like ours. Parents warned their children not to marry into certain families, though no reason was spoken. In hushed tones, people told of clans that seemed to carry unnatural fortune, of tribes whose leaders had too much command in their voices, of wanderers whose shadows seemed too long at sunset. None of it could be proven, but the unease grew like roots, twisting deep into memory. The curse of the Nephilim was not something people wanted to name, yet it was something they could never ignore. Children heard the stories in fragments, catching them from the lips of elders when they thought no one listened. They learned of men who could lift stones that should not be moved, of women who walked unafraid into forests where beasts prowled, of sons whose anger was like fire, impossible to quench once lit. Some of these children grew afraid of themselves. wondering if the strength in their limbs or the sharpness of their gaze meant they carried something unwanted. Others grew proud, imagining themselves heirs to a power lost to the flood. And so the old blood, whether it truly remained or not, began to shape identity, becoming as much belief as it was memory. Stories traveled with wanderers, and in every land they were retold with subtle differences. Some spoke of cursed families who could not escape misfortune, where every harvest withered and every child died young. Others told of hidden kings descended from giants, rulers whose presence bent the will of men and whose descendants still sat on secret thrones. Some stories took on darker shades, claiming that the blood of giants brought with it a hunger for domination, a restlessness that no peace could soothe. These tales spread like mist, shaping the way people looked at strangers, the way they explained the strange, the way they feared what they could not control. At night, when children pressed close to their mothers, they were told of the dangers of pride and the shadows of bloodlines. Do not seek power too quickly. Do not grow arrogant, for that path belongs to the giants. The words settled into their hearts, shaping them into cautious dreamers, afraid of reaching too high, wary of strength that seemed unnatural. In this way, the curse lived not in the body, but in the mind, passed down as inheritance through story. There were those, however, who leaned toward the mystery instead of the fear. For them, the possibility of Nephilim traces was not a warning, but a wonder. They whispered that such bloodlines carried hidden gifts, strength unmatched, wisdom beyond years, the ability to see the unseen. They sought out those rumored to be descendants, offering them reverence, asking for guidance, believing that perhaps the heavens had not destroyed all traces of the old world, but left behind fragments for purpose. Such beliefs created division between those who feared the curse and those who revered it. And so the shadow of the Nephilim became not just memory, but a living tension, shaping bonds between tribes, weaving suspicion into kinship. Generations passed, but the wisp, Urs, did not fade. In lonely villages, children with strange dreams grew into prophets. In hidden valleys, hunters who never missed became leaders. In forgotten corners of the world, faces too striking, voices too commanding, drew followers without effort. Whether truth or legend, the belief in cursed bloodlines endured, filling silence with unease. It explained the unexplainable, gave form to the mysterious, and ensured that even long after the flood, the giants were not forgotten. Wanderers passing through told of seeing immense footprints pressed deep into hardened stone, though no giant had walked there in living memory. Others spoke of bones uncovered by storms, too large to belong to ordinary men. In the telling, such discoveries were never mere accidents of nature, but proof that something of the Nephilim still lingered, hidden beneath the dust. Each tale added weight to the suspicion that the old blood had not been entirely erased, that somewhere in the world it still pulsed quietly, waiting. And in the quietest moments, when the wind moved across empty fields, people still lowered their voices and asked one another questions they never answered. Could the old strength rise again? Could the curse awake in a child not yet born? Could the pride of giants breathe once more in the hearts of men? No one knew, and that mystery itself kept the whispers alive. The Nephilim lived on, not in flesh, but in rumor, in suspicion, in the restless beating of blood that might still carry echoes of their power. Beneath the weight of the earth, under mountains that stood like watchful giants themselves, there was said to be a prison unlike any other. It was not built by human hands, nor carved by time, but sealed by divine command. Those who had once walked among the people, clothed in strange beauty and terrible might, the watchers who had strayed from their heavenly purpose, were no longer free to roam the world. They had been bound, cast into the deep places of shadow, hidden beneath rock and soil where no man could reach. Yet though their chains were unseen, their voices still lingered. People said that on certain nights, when the wind pressed through caves and whistled against stone, the sound carried something more than air. It was the sorrow of those who had fallen, a whispering that could chill even the bravest heart. Travelers told of wandering into cavern mouths at dusk, seeking shelter from the coming dark, only to hear sounds that seemed too much like speech. At first it was faint, like sighs slipping through narrow passages, but then it grew clearer. The echoes of voices that spoke no tongue known to men. Some swore that if one listened too long, the whispers became pleading, urging the listener closer, pulling them deeper into the earth. Few dared follow, for they knew the stories of the bound ones. Their prison was not meant to be approached. To draw near was to invite despair. And yet, the mystery clung to the air, making every cave mouth a threshold between the living world and the hidden cries below. Children gathered near fires would be warned never to wander alone near cliffs or hollow stones, for that was where the abyss breathed. Their elders told them of shepherds who vanished into cracks in the earth, never to return. Of miners who dug too greedily, only to stumble upon a chamber where the walls hummed with sorrow. Those who emerged spoke no more, their eyes clouded as though they had seen something too heavy for words. From that silence, the legends grew. People said the watchers wept for what they had lost, for the children they could no longer reach, for the sky they could no longer touch. Others claimed their cries were not of grief but of rage, each whisper a vow that they would one day break free. There were nights when storms moved across the land, and thunder rolled in the distance like the breaking of chains. In such moments, people pressed their doors shut and whispered prayers, fearing that the watchers beneath might stir. For when the earth trembled, it was easy to believe that something vast was shifting below. The cries of the abyss felt closer then, riding with the wind, crawling under the silence between thunderclaps. Mothers hushed their children quickly, telling them not to listen, not to let their hearts be drawn toward the sound. Yet curiosity lingered in every listener. For even as the whispers terrified, they also beckoned, soft as a lullaby sung in a language too old to name. Those who studied the old stories claimed that the watchers had been placed in chains not of iron, but of shadow, their spirits bound beneath mountains deep where the rivers of the earth meet. They were said to sit in darkness, unable to move, yet able to pour out their sorrow into the hollow places of creation. Some even believed the moaning winds of night were not winds at all, but the voices of the fallen stretched thin through the corridors of stone. To hear them was to brush against forbidden knowledge, to feel the weight of ages pressing down on one's chest. A man could come away changed, unable to sleep without hearing echoes in the quiet, unable to pray without imagining unseen eyes watching from the dark below. Legends told of wanderers who tried to follow the whispers, thinking they might uncover secrets hidden since the flood. They carried torches into the earth, descending deeper than men should go, seeking the source of the voices. Their flames flickered against walls carved by no hand, marked with signs that no tribe could read. In the end, their torches went out, and they never returned. Villagers who waited above said they could still hear their screams long after, mixed with the cries of the abyss, as though the watchers had claimed them into their prison. It was said that anyone who dared too near could become trapped, not in body, but in spirit, bound to the sorrowful song of those beneath the earth. Even in open places, the whispers sometimes reached the ears of the sleepless. Shepherds lying under the stars swore they heard voices riding with the night winds, faint yet insistent, as though calling them by name. Sailors spoke of nights when the sea was calm, but the air was filled with sighs, stretching out across the waves like chains rattling far below the surface. Farmers tilling their land at dawn told of hearing murmurs rising from the ground, as though the soil itself was restless. In each telling, the pattern was the same. Voices where no voices should be, sorrow where no man had spoken, a presence in silence too heavy to ignore. The whispers did not always sound mournful. Sometimes they shifted into tones of warning, like cries of anger cloaked in wind. In the dark hours before dawn, when sleep was thinnest and hearts most restless, people said the voices carried a rhythm like weeping turned to rage. The air grew heavy, pressing against the ears, and for a moment it felt as though the abyss itself leaned close to listen. Those who endured such nights woke pale, their dreams troubled, as if they had been near a fire that burned without flame. They described wuhus, as they could not understand yet felt in their bones, words that spoke of longing, of chains, of a hunger that had not faded with time. Some priests said the voices were a test, a reminder of what disobedience had cost, the sorrow of beings who had fallen from light into endless night. They told their people not to fear, but to remember, for the cries were proof that even the mighty could fall, and even the strong could be undone. Yet others feared that the whispers were not warnings but invitations, small openings through which the bound ones reached toward the world above, hoping for someone to listen, someone to answer, someone to break the seal of their prison. And so each interpretation carried its own danger. To hear them as sorrow was to feel pity, to hear them as rage was to feel dread, to hear them as invitation was to risk being drawn into their fate. The caves still breathe with these tales. The mountains still echo with their mystery. In lonely valleys where wind sighs through hollow stones, listeners still pause, straining to hear what lies beneath the earth. Whether sorrowful or wrathful, real or imagined, the whispers remain. They slip into dreams, they curl around the edges of silence, they wait in the dark corners of the world. And though the chains of the watchers hold firm, their voices cannot be bound. They move with the wind, they seep through the soil, they ride the currents of night, carrying with them the memory of rebellion and the endless cry of those who are hidden in the abyss. There were words passed down through fading parchments, hidden in whispers of forgotten elders, and murmured in prayers that trembled between hope and fear. They spoke not only of what had been, but of what might come again. The tales of giants were not always told as history alone, but as a warning that their shadow had not been erased. Though the waters of the flood had swept across the earth and buried the old world beneath waves, some fragments of prophecy hinted that what was bound might one day stir, and what was silenced might one day cry out again. These words lived like echoes in the memory of generations, carried quietly yet firmly, as though time itself refused to let the thought of the giants vanish completely. The sound of such prophecy was not shouted nor carved into great monuments. It came in hushed tones, in the language of dreams, in the trembling voice of a watchman who woke at dawn pale and restless, unable to shake the vision that had visited him in the night. The giants, they said, were not gone forever. Their story was woven into the fabric of the world, and the fabric was frayed. Some believed that when the chains of the bound watchers shifted in their deep prison, their children's memory stirred with them. The earth, heavy with their bones, still carried their weight. And if the ground could remember, could it not also give birth again? Prophecy often came in pictures, not plain words. Men and women dreamed of tall figures standing against the sky, their heads brushing the stars, their shadows stretching across valleys where villages hid in silence. These were not mere phantoms, the dreamers insisted, but warnings clothed in visions. When asked what the giants said in those dreams, the answer was almost always the same: nothing. They stood in silence, but their presence was the prophecy. Their return did not need to be spoken. It was felt, heavy and undeniable, like the way one senses a storm on the horizon before a single cloud has formed. Some fragments of scrolls hinted that a time would come when knowledge long buried would rise again. These writings, faded and broken, spoke of cycles, times when the hidden sought the surface, when the forbidden pressed against the edges of the world of men. One line was often repeated by those who studied such words: "As it was before, so shall it be again." The meaning was never fully explained, yet it clung to the hearts of those who heard it. For if the earth had once been filled with mighty ones, then perhaps history itself bent in patterns, and those patterns could bring their footsteps back to the soil of men. The suspense of this thought was like a soft wind before midnight, gentle yet unsettling. It stirred curtains in the mind, making one wonder what shape the world might take if such beings truly returned. Would they come as destroyers, vast and terrible, or as wanderers whose sorrow weighed heavier than their strength? Would the world recognize them, or dismiss them as shadows of myth until their presence grew too great to ignore? Such questions turned in the hearts of the listeners, leaving them restless, as though the prophecies were less about predicting events and more about planting unease in the spirit. It was said that certain prophets long ago had been shown glimpses of an age when the barriers between the heavens and earth would thin again. In those moments, what was hidden would rise, and the children of the Ancient Ones would walk in the daylight. The language was veiled, as prophecy often is, but the message pressed through. The story was not finished. Dreams of a world trembling beneath enormous footsteps carried with them a sense of inevitability, as though the future and the past were not two separate things, but the same song played on different notes. People listened to these words with eyes wide, their hearts half fearful and half entranced, unable to turn away from the possibility that the ground beneath them might not always remain silent. In small villages, old seers told children not to dismiss the tales of giants as simple legends. They would point to the mountains, saying that even their stillness was a kind of prophecy, for mountains too had once been moved, shaped by beings whose strength defied imagination. And though time had covered their tracks with snow and forest, the memory could not be erased. "What sleeps may wake," the seers would murmur, their voices soft, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might call something forth. The children would huddle close, frightened yet unwilling to leave, their eyes reflecting the firelight as though they too carried a piece of the prophecy inside them. Sometimes, the words came not in dreams or stories, but in strange patterns that haunted the land itself. Travelers told of stones set upright in lonely fields, arranged in ways no farmer could explain. At night, the wind through those stones carried a sound like murmuring, as though voices too old to be understood were speaking through the earth. Those who lingered there claimed to feel watched, as if unseen eyes studied them from beyond time. These places were seen as marks, silent warnings left in stone to remind the living that the world still held memory of what had walked before. To those who believed, these standing stones were prophecies written not with ink, but with earth itself. The suspense of such ideas pressed hardest in the quiet hours of night when the mind drifts and dreams stir. Many people admitted to seeing visions of towering shadows in their sleep, their forms half hidden, their presence undeniable. The dreams were not always violent. Sometimes the giants simply walked, their enormous steps carrying them past mountains and seas, as though searching for something long lost. Yet even in their silence, the dreams felt heavy with warning. To dream of giants was to wake with a lingering weight, as if the prophecy had left a stone upon the chest, pressing the sleeper to remember. There were even those who claimed the prophecy was not distant at all, but already unfolding. They pointed to unrest in the earth, to storms heavier than before, to strange cries carried on the wind that sounded like voices trapped in stone. To them, these were signs, subtle yet undeniable, of something stirring below. They spoke with the certainty of those who had seen visions, that the chains of the Ancient Ones would not hold forever. And though others dismissed them as dreamers, the unease in their words could not be easily forgotten. For once the thought of return entered the mind, it took root, growing quietly in the background of every silence. The mood of these prophecies was never one of peace. It was not terror either, but something in between, a suspense that lulled like a dream while leaving a shadow across the heart. People listened and felt both soothed and unsettled, as if they had been told a lullaby that carried a hidden warning. The idea of giants returning was both too strange to believe and too haunting to dismiss. And so the words lived on, passed gently from voice to voice, lingering like smoke in the corners of the mind, shaping the dreams of those who heard them. The night sky stretched endlessly above, soft and unbroken, carrying countless stars that shimmered like gentle lanterns hung by unseen hands. Their glow was quiet, patient, and eternal, as though reminding every restless heart that the heavens had always been there and always would be. Beneath this vast canopy of light, stories of giants, watchers, and ancient struggles seemed to soften, becoming not heavy chains of fear, but distant echoes, part of a grander design that moved beyond human understanding. The darkness of the world, with all its mysteries and shadows, was not without order. For above it, beyond it, through it, there remained a presence greater than the rise and fall of any mighty being, and that presence never lost control. The stars had watched the flood, when waters silenced the roar of the Nephilim and cleansed the land of chaos. They had witnessed the cries of the bound watchers, buried deep in gloom where no hand of man could reach. They had seen generations rise and fall, kings come and go, wars shake the earth, and still their light shone the same. If the giants had once filled the earth, and if their shadows still lingered in prophecy, even that was not beyond the sight of the one who placed the stars in their place. Their stories were great, yet not greater than the author who allowed them to be told. In this gentle thought, the restless found peace, for nothing had ever slipped beyond his hand. The quiet ending beneath the stars did not come with thunder or fire. It came with stillness, like a lullaby whispered through the breeze of night. The fears of giants returning, the haunting weight of bound spirits crying from the depths, and the whispers of ancient curses, all of it melted into calm when measured against the divine plan that had already triumphed before and would always triumph again. The stars themselves seemed to declare it, that was so had felt endless to men was only a passing shadow. The light above was older, stronger, more enduring, and its message was simple: peace remains, even when the earth trembles. Those who listened to the old tales often ended with this thought. They had spoken of giants with great awe, of their strength and their downfall. They had spoken of strange dreams, of prophecies that warned of returns, of whispers buried deep in the soil. Yet when the night came and the heart grew weary, the stories rested not in fear, but in surrender. For no matter what rose from the dust, no matter what secrets remained hidden in the mountains or beneath the seas, the final word belonged not to the mighty ones of old, but to the Creator whose will shaped their beginning and their end. The listener, weary from the weight of mystery, could lay down in that truth as one lays down on soft ground beneath the stars. The night wind often felt like a part of this quiet plan, brushing against faces, carrying the scent of trees and earth, reminding souls that life went on and that the present moment was safe. Even when stories spoke of terrible beings, the stillness of the stars reminded hearts that the world continued to turn. No darkness, no giant, no watcher had ever undone the rhythm of dawn and dusk. And so, as listeners allowed their eyes to grow heavy, they too could rest in that rhythm. The heavens declared constancy, the earth breathed gently beneath, and the soul found itself wrapped in a safety that needed no explanation. There was something soothing about knowing that the struggles of ancient times were not forgotten, yet they were also not repeated in the same way. The divine had already shown its power in sweeping away chaos once, and it could do so again, should it ever be needed. The giants who once walked the valleys and cast their shadows upon villages were no longer here, and their memory was now only a part of the tapestry of history. They had been mighty, yes, but they had also been fleeting. The stars, steady in their watch, taught this simple truth: everything has its season, and no shadow outlasts the light. It was this gentle assurance that filled the heart with sukoon, the kind of peace that seeps deep into the spirit and lingers. The listener could close their eyes and feel no weight of dread, for the ending of all things lay not in the hands of what once was feared, but in the hands of the one who wrote the beginning. And his ending was always good. Even if the giants were to rise in stories again, even if whispers in the earth hinted at ancient voices, they could never unseat the stillness of the heavens. For the heavens were eternal, and their song was one of victory already won. The gentle closure beneath the stars felt like a hand placed softly upon the heart, calming it, quieting it, reminding it that all was well. The old stories of giants had their place, their mystery, their warning. But when weighed against the divine plan, they were not reasons for fear, only reminders of the strength that always prevailed. The one who scattered the stars had also written the fate of the Nephilim, and nothing stood outside his design. And so, as the night grew deeper and the world grew quiet, the listener too could sink into rest, assured that the story was safe, that they were safe. The endless sky above, filled with its calm light, seemed to lean closer, as though wrapping every weary soul in a vast, quiet embrace. The earth lay still, the winds carried no burden, and the heart, after wandering through tales of mystery and might, could finally return to rest. There, beneath the stars, all questions lost their urgency, and all fears lost their sharpness. The only thing that remained was peace. Soft, enduring, complete. It was the kind of peace that made the listeners' breathing slow, their eyes heavy, their spirit light, until they too became part of the night's stillness, safe beneath the stars.